Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I'm not sure where to begin with this account, or even if I should be sharing it at all. The events I'm about to describe happened to me in the summer of 2015, and I still wake up in cold sweats thinking about that day. Every therapist I've spoken to suggests I write it down, that somehow putting words to the nightmare might help me process what happened. So here I am, 2 years later, finally finding the courage to tell someone. My name doesn't matter much, but what matters is that I've always been an avid hiker. The mountains of Utah have been my sanctuary for as long as I can remember. There's something about the solitude, the crisp air, and the way the wilderness strips away all the noise of civilization that has always called to me. I never hiked alone, though. My faithful companion was always by my side. Storm, my 3-year-old German Shepherd, had been with me on every trail for the past 2 years. She was more than just a dog. She was my early warning system, my protector, and my best friend rolled into one loyal package. That particular morning in July started like any other. I was scrolling through my hiking app, looking for a new trail we hadn't explored yet. Storm was lying at my feet, her ears perked up every time I said the word hike. She knew the routine by now, the sound of my hiking boots being laced up, the rustle of the backpack, the jingle of her collar as I attached her leash. These were the signals that meant adventure. As I browsed through the familiar trail listings, something caught my eye. At the very bottom of the results was an entry I'd never noticed before. The trail was listed simply as Raven's Hollow Pass with minimal information. No difficulty rating, no distance marker, just a single review that read, "Peaceful. Worth the drive." Something about its mysterious nature intrigued me. Perhaps it was a hidden gem that hadn't been discovered by the masses yet. The drive directions led us deep into a canyon I'd only passed through before, never stopping. The road wound through towering rock formations that seemed to lean in on us as we drove deeper into the wilderness. Storm sat in the passenger seat, her nose pressed against the window, watching the landscape change from suburban sprawl to untamed nature. After 45 minutes of driving on increasingly narrow roads, we reached what could generously be called a parking area. It was nothing more than a widened shoulder of gravel that could maybe accommodate 3 vehicles if they parked creatively. The isolation was complete. No other cars, no signs of recent human activity, just us and the overwhelming silence of the mountains. I should have taken this as a warning sign. The trailhead was marked by nothing more than a small wooden post with a faded arrow pointing into the forest. No maps, no warning signs, no emergency contact information, just that lonely arrow directing us into the unknown. I strapped on my pack, which contained the usual supplies: first aid kit, emergency food, water, knife, and Storm's breakfast of raw beef that I'd planned to give her once the morning chill wore off. Storm seemed unusually alert as we began our ascent. Normally, she would bound ahead, nose to the ground, investigating every interesting scent the trail had to offer. But today she stayed close to my side, her ears constantly swiveling as if listening for something I couldn't hear. Her behavior should have been another red flag, but I attributed it to the unfamiliar environment. The first portion of the trail was a grueling uphill climb through dense pine forest. The trees grew so close together that they formed a canopy overhead, blocking out most of the morning sun and creating an artificial twilight that made it difficult to judge the time. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, but underneath those familiar forest smells was something else. Something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. As we climbed higher, the forest began to change. The trees grew farther apart, and patches of sunlight started to penetrate the canopy. The oppressive feeling of being enclosed began to lift, and I felt my spirits rise with the elevation. Storm seemed to relax slightly as well, though she still maintained a level of alertness that was unusual for her. After about an hour of steady climbing, we reached what appeared to be a plateau. The trail leveled out and began to wind through a more open forest of aspen and birch. Their pale bark created a striking contrast against the darker pines we'd left behind. It was beautiful, the kind of scenery that makes you grateful to be alive and reminds you why you seek out these remote places. But beauty in the wilderness can be deceiving, and I was about to learn that lesson in the most terrifying way possible. The trail eventually opened into a magnificent alpine meadow that took my breath away. It was roughly circular, perhaps 100 yards across, surrounded by towering peaks that seemed to pierce the sky. Wildflowers dotted the grass in brilliant splashes of color. Purple lupine, yellow arnica, and white mountain avens creating a natural tapestry that no artist could replicate. The sound of running water drew my attention to the far side of the meadow, where I could see a waterfall cascading down the rock face. The noise was soothing, a constant white noise that seemed to make the meadow feel even more peaceful and isolated. This was exactly the kind of place I'd been hoping to find, pristine, untouched, and far from the crowds that flocked to the more popular trails. Storm and I made our way toward the center of the meadow, both of us taking in the spectacular scenery. The grass was knee-high in places, and I could see the trail continuing on the far side, winding its way up toward higher elevations. I was mentally planning our route when Storm suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. She stood frozen in front of me, every muscle in her body tense, staring at something ahead of us that I hadn't yet noticed. Her hackles were raised, creating a ridge of fur along her spine, and a low growl was rumbling deep in her throat. I'd never seen her react this way before. Not to other hikers, not to wildlife, not to anything. Following her gaze, I looked across the meadow to where she was staring. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Just grass swaying in the breeze, flowers nodding on their stems, and the peaceful backdrop of the mountains. But then my eyes focused on a shape near the tree line on the opposite side of the meadow. There was a figure standing motionless among the trees, partially obscured by shadows and distance. At first glance, it appeared to be another hiker, perhaps someone who had arrived before us and was also taking in the view. But something about the figure seemed wrong. The way it stood so perfectly still, the unnatural positioning of its limbs, the way it seemed to blend into the shadows while simultaneously standing out from them. And then there was the smell. The odor hit me like a physical blow, so strong and putrid that I immediately pulled my shirt up over my nose and mouth. It was the smell of decay, of something that had been rotting in the sun for far too long. My eyes began to water, and I felt my stomach lurch as the stench invaded my nostrils and seemed to coat the back of my throat with its foulness. Storm's growling became more pronounced, and she began to back up, pressing against my legs as if trying to push me away from whatever was ahead of us. Her reaction confirmed what my instincts were already telling me. Something was very, very wrong here. I squinted across the meadow, trying to get a better look at the figure. It was roughly human-shaped but seemed too tall, too angular. The way it stood suggested someone who was either severely injured or under the influence of drugs. There was an unnaturalness to its posture that made my skin crawl. The smell continued to intensify, and I realized it had to be coming from whatever was standing across from us. No animal, no plant, nothing natural could produce such an overwhelming stench of corruption. I'd encountered dead animals on hikes before, deer that had died of disease, elk that had fallen from cliffs, but this was different. This smell had a human quality to it that made it infinitely more disturbing. As I watched, the figure began to move. It didn't walk so much as lurch, its movements jerky and uncoordinated. With each step it took toward us, the smell grew stronger, until I was fighting the urge to vomit. Storm's growls had escalated to sharp barks of warning, her body coiled like a spring ready to either attack or flee. I began to back away slowly, keeping my eyes on the approaching figure. Every survival instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't tear my gaze away from the horrifying spectacle moving toward us. As it got closer, I could see that what I had initially taken for hiking clothes were actually tattered rags hanging from an emaciated frame. Dark stains covered the fabric, and I realized with growing horror that they looked suspiciously like dried blood. The figure's face was obscured by long, matted hair, but I could see pale skin that appeared to be mottled with dark patches. Its movements became more agitated as it drew nearer, and I could hear a sound coming from it, a low moaning that seemed to contain both pain and rage. That's when I realized what I was looking at, and the understanding hit me like ice water in my veins. This wasn't some mysterious creature or supernatural entity. This was a human being, or what remained of one. Someone who had become lost in these mountains, perhaps weeks or months ago, and had somehow survived in a state that was barely recognizable as human. The smell, the appearance, the behavior. It all pointed to someone who had been living like a wild animal, perhaps driven mad by isolation, hunger, and exposure. I'd heard stories of people disappearing in the wilderness, of hikers who wandered off trail and were never found. But I'd never imagined what might happen to someone who survived such an ordeal for an extended period. The human mind, when pushed to its absolute limits, can break in ways that transform a person into something unrecognizable. The figure was close enough now that I could see its eyes, or at least the dark hollows where its eyes should have been. They seemed to stare directly at me with an intensity that made my blood freeze. There was intelligence there, but it was a twisted, predatory intelligence that had been warped by whatever horrors this person had endured and perhaps committed. Storm's barking became frantic, and she began pulling at my pants leg, trying to drag me away from the approaching threat. I didn't need any more encouragement. Whatever this person had become, they were clearly dangerous, and we were far from any help. The nearest other hikers were probably hours away, and there was no cell service this deep in the mountains. I turned and ran. The sound that erupted behind me will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a shriek of rage and hunger that seemed to combine human vocal cords with something primal and animalistic. It was the sound of someone who had crossed a line from which there was no return, someone who had embraced their darkest impulses and abandoned their humanity entirely. I could hear crashing through the brush behind me as the figure gave chase. Storm was running beside me, her own panic evident in the way her tongue lolled out and her breathing came in sharp pants. The trail seemed to narrow as we fled, and branches whipped at my face and arms, leaving scratches that burned but barely registered through my adrenaline-fueled terror. The sounds of pursuit grew louder behind us, and I realized with growing horror that our pursuer was gaining ground. Whatever physical deterioration they had suffered, they still possessed a desperate strength that allowed them to move through the rough terrain with frightening speed. The crashing grew closer, accompanied by that inhuman shrieking that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. Storm suddenly veered off to the right, away from the main trail. Dogs have instincts that we've lost, and I trusted her judgment completely. I followed her through a gap in the trees, branches tearing at my clothes and pack. The terrain became rougher, rocky outcroppings and fallen logs creating obstacles that slowed our progress, but might also slow our pursuer. As we scrambled over a particularly large boulder, I heard Storm yelp in pain behind me. I spun around to see her limping, favoring her right front leg. In her panic to escape, she must have caught her paw between rocks or stepped wrong on the uneven ground. My heart broke as I saw her struggling to keep up, her loyalty driving her to continue despite her injury. The sounds of pursuit had momentarily stopped, and in the sudden silence, I could hear my own ragged breathing and the thundering of my heart. Had we lost them? Had they given up the chase? Or were they simply pausing to listen for us, trying to determine which direction we had gone? I carefully lifted Storm into my arms, all 85 pounds of her. She was breathing heavily, her tongue hanging out, but she didn't struggle. She trusted me completely, just as I had trusted her instincts to lead us away from danger. My arms burned with the effort of carrying her, but I knew I couldn't leave her behind. The sound of the waterfall was growing louder, and I realized Storm had been leading us toward the water. Perhaps she had reasoned that the noise would help mask our presence, or maybe she simply knew that water meant safety. Either way, I was grateful for her guidance as we made our way through the increasingly dense vegetation toward the source of the sound. Behind us, the shrieking resumed, closer than before. Our pursuer had picked up our trail again. The forest opened up as we neared the waterfall, and I could see the cascade tumbling down a sheer rock face into a pool below. The noise was tremendous, drowning out all other sounds and providing a kind of acoustic camouflage that might help hide our location. The spray from the falling water created a fine mist that felt refreshing against my overheated skin. I carried Storm toward the base of the waterfall, looking for somewhere we could hide and hopefully wait out our pursuer. The rocks were slippery with moisture, but I managed to find a narrow ledge behind the falling water where we could huddle together. The space was cramped and wet, but it was concealed and defensible. Storm was shivering, whether from cold, pain, or fear I couldn't tell. Her paw was swollen, and I could see that she was trying not to put any weight on it. I gently examined the injury and found what appeared to be a deep cut, probably from a sharp rock. The wound was bleeding, but not severely. I pulled off my jacket and wrapped it around her paw to help stop the bleeding and keep the injury clean. The sound of crashing through the underbrush reached us even over the noise of the waterfall. Our pursuer was close, very close. I held Storm tightly against me. Both of us pressed back against the cold rock wall as far as we could go. The falling water created a curtain in front of us, but I could still see shadowy shapes moving beyond it. Then I saw the figure emerge from the tree line. Up close, the sight was even more horrifying than I had imagined. This had once been a person, but months of living in the wilderness had transformed them into something barely recognizable as human. Their clothes were little more than rags hanging from a skeletal frame. Their hair was long and matted with filth, and their skin was covered in open sores and scabs. But it was their eyes that terrified me the most. They burned with a feral intelligence that spoke of someone who had not just survived in the wilderness, but had thrived by abandoning every moral constraint that separates humans from animals. They moved to the edge of the pool, sniffing the air like a predator tracking prey. The smell of decay that surrounded them was overwhelming, even with the fresh mist from the waterfall. I realized that the stench wasn't just from poor hygiene. This person had been eating things that no human should eat, consuming whatever they could find to survive, including things that had been dead for far too long. The figure stood at the water's edge for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. They seemed to know we were nearby, but the sound and spray of the waterfall was masking our exact location. Several times they moved toward our hiding spot, only to turn away at the last moment, perhaps distracted by some other sound or scent. Storm remained perfectly still in my arms, though I could feel her heart racing against my chest. She seemed to understand that our lives depended on absolute silence. The cold water was soaking through our clothes, and I could feel hypothermia beginning to set in, but I didn't dare move. Finally, another sound echoed through the forest, a distant scream that seemed to come from the direction we had originally come from. Our pursuer's head snapped toward the sound, and after a moment of listening, they let out an answering shriek and began moving back toward the meadow. Perhaps there were other hikers on the trail, new prey that was easier to catch than two people hiding behind a waterfall. I waited until the sounds of movement had completely faded before carefully emerging from our hiding place. Storm was able to limp on 3 legs, and together we made our way back toward the main trail. My pack had been torn and scattered during our flight, but I managed to find my car keys still attached to my belt. The hike back to the parking area was a nightmare of looking over our shoulders and jumping at every sound. Every shadow could hide our pursuer, every rustle in the bushes could signal another attack. But we made it to the car without further incident, and I have never been so grateful to hear the sound of an engine starting. The drive to the emergency veterinary clinic was a blur of panic and tears. Storm needed surgery to repair the damage to her paw, and the veterinarians asked what had happened. I told them it was a bear attack. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. How could I explain that we had been stalked through the wilderness by what had once been a human being? The authorities were never notified. I was too traumatized to speak coherently about what had happened, and part of me worried that no one would believe such an outlandish story. But I often wonder about other hikers who might venture into those remote mountains, and I pray that they never encounter what we encountered that day. Storm recovered from her injuries, though she developed a permanent limp and has never been the same around strangers. We still hike together occasionally, but never on unfamiliar trails, and never without multiple forms of communication and emergency equipment. I've tried to research missing persons reports from that area, but the information is sparse and often incomplete. How many people disappear in the wilderness each year? How many of them actually die? And how many simply change into something else entirely? I don't know the answers to these questions, and part of me doesn't want to know. What I do know is that there are things in the remote wilderness that are far more terrifying than any bear or mountain lion. Sometimes the most dangerous predator in the forest walks on two legs and was once someone's child, someone's sibling, someone's friend. The mountains are beautiful, but they are also merciless. They can take a person and strip away everything that makes them human, leaving behind something that exists in the space between life and death, between sanity and madness. I still have nightmares about that day. I wake up in the middle of the night thinking I can smell that overwhelming stench of decay and hear that inhuman shrieking echoing through my bedroom. My therapist says the trauma will fade with time, but I'm not so sure. Some experiences mark you permanently, changing the way you see the world and your place in it. That day in the mountains was one of those experiences for me. It taught me that humanity is far more fragile than we like to believe, and that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we want to admit. If you're planning to venture into remote wilderness areas, please be careful. Carry proper communication equipment, tell people where you're going, and trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, if your gut tells you to leave, don't hesitate. The mountains don't forgive mistakes, and sometimes survival means abandoning your curiosity and embracing your fear. God help anyone else who stumbles across that meadow, because I'm not sure there's any other kind of help available that deep in the wilderness. The trail wound deeper into Canyon del Diablo than any of us had anticipated. What started as an ambitious day hike in early October 2020 had stretched into something far more demanding. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as we descended, our water bottles growing lighter with each passing hour. I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m. We'd been hiking for nearly 6 hours. "Are you sure this is the right trail?" Zoe called from behind me, her voice strained with exhaustion. Sweat stained her hiking shirt despite the cooling afternoon air. I consulted the crumpled topographic map one more time, tracing our route with a grimy finger. The contour lines seemed to blur together in the fading light. According to this, we should reach the designated camping area within the next mile. Behind Zoe, our companions struggled with their heavy packs. Riley, always the complainer, muttered something about poor planning under his breath. Ava kept checking her phone for signal bars that would never come in this remote corner of Utah. Vincent brought up the rear, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by grim determination. The canyon walls rose around us like ancient monuments, their stratified layers telling stories of geological time that dwarfed our brief human existence. Petroglyphs marked certain cliff faces, primitive figures and spirals carved by hands that had crumbled to dust centuries ago. Something about those crude drawings unsettled me, though I couldn't articulate why. As shadows began to stretch across the narrow canyon floor, the temperature dropped noticeably. The oppressive heat that had baked us during our descent gave way to an almost unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the rock walls themselves. Goosebumps rose on my arms despite my long sleeves. There. Ava pointed ahead where the canyon widened slightly. Is that our campsite? A grove of ancient cottonwoods clustered around what appeared to be a natural spring. The trees' massive trunks and gnarled branches spoke of decades of growth in this harsh environment. Beneath their canopy, level ground promised respite from the rocky trail we'd been navigating. We set up camp with practiced efficiency, though something felt wrong about the place. The usual desert sounds, insects, distant bird calls, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, were completely absent. Even the wind seemed muted here, as if the canyon walls absorbed sound rather than echoing it. "Why is it so quiet?" Vincent asked, voicing what we all felt. He hammered tent stakes into the hard-packed earth with unnecessary force, the metallic ringing unnaturally loud in the stillness. Riley shrugged, focused on inflating his sleeping pad. "Desert's always quiet at night, besides we're miles from civilization. What did you expect?" But this felt different. Wrong. The silence pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight. I'd camped in remote locations throughout the Southwest, and there was always some ambient noise, wind through rock formations, the distant call of coyotes, the scurrying of rodents. Here, nothing. As darkness fell with startling suddenness, we gathered around the campfire I'd built from dead cottonwood branches. The flames danced higher than seemed natural, casting wild shadows that writhed across the cliff faces surrounding us. In that flickering light, the petroglyphs appeared to move, the primitive figures seeming to shift and dance in my peripheral vision. "God, it's good to sit down," Zoe groaned, settling onto a fallen log near the fire. She pulled off her hiking boots and wiggled her toes in their damp socks. "My feet are killing me." The warmth from the flames felt good against my face, though it did little to dispel the unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from the canyon walls. I distributed energy bars from my pack while Ava set up her small camp stove to boil water for instant coffee. "So what's the plan for tomorrow?" Riley asked, consulting his GPS device. The screen glowed eerily in the firelight, showing our position as a lonely blip surrounded by vast emptiness. This place isn't exactly on the tourist trail. I'd done extensive research before planning this trip, poring over geological surveys and historical documents about the region. The canyon continues for another 8 miles before connecting with a Forest Service road. We can either retrace our steps or continue forward. Both routes are about the same distance. Vincent poked at the fire with a long stick, sending sparks spiraling into the black sky above. "What about that ranger station you mentioned? The one that's supposed to be abandoned?" "About 3 miles ahead," I confirmed. "Built in the 1940s as a fire watch, abandoned in the 1970s when they switched to aircraft surveillance. There are some old mining claims in this area too, silver prospects that never panned out." The mention of abandoned places seemed to kindle something in Ava's imagination. "I love old structures in remote places. They always have such interesting histories. Did anyone actually live at that ranger station?" I nodded, remembering the details from a local history book I'd found. A ranger named Garrett Stevens was stationed there for nearly 20 years. According to records, he was found dead in 1978, apparent heart attack. They say he'd been dead for weeks before anyone discovered him. "Cheerful," Zoe muttered, sipping her instant coffee. remind me why we chose this place for our annual camping trip? The truth was, I'd felt drawn to this remote canyon in ways I couldn't fully explain. The maps showed it as largely unexplored, with minimal human traffic and no developed trails. Something about that isolation appealed to me. The chance to experience genuine wilderness, untouched by modern civilization. But sitting here in the unnatural silence, I began to question that decision. The fire crackled and spit, the only sound breaking the oppressive quiet. Even that seemed muffled, as if the air itself dampened noise. "You know," I said, lowering my voice instinctively, "there are some interesting local legends about this area." Riley rolled his eyes. "Here we go. Let me guess. Ghost stories?" "Not exactly ghosts," I replied, settling back against a boulder. The rock felt unnaturally cold against my spine. "The indigenous peoples who lived here, the P.28 and earlier cultures, they had stories about this place, called it a place of voices." Vincent leaned forward, interested despite himself. "What kind of voices?" I'd found references to these stories in an obscure anthropological journal, documented by researchers in the early 1900s before such knowledge was largely lost. According to their oral traditions, certain places in the desert were inhabited by what they called echo people, entities that could perfectly mimic human speech, using familiar voices to lure travelers astray. The fire popped loudly, making us all jump slightly. In the startled silence that followed, I thought I heard something else. A faint sound that might have been laughter, echoing from somewhere high above us. "Did you hear that?" Ava whispered, her eyes wide in the firelight. We sat frozen, listening intently. The silence stretched on, broken only by the gentle snap and hiss of burning wood. Finally, Riley snorted with forced bravado. "Just wind through the rocks. These canyon formations create all kinds of acoustic effects." But I'd studied the geological reports extensively, and the rock formations here weren't the type to create unusual echoes. The sandstone walls rose smooth and sheer, with few of the cavities or overhangs that might trap and redirect sound. Zoe pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. "Maybe we should talk about something else. This place is creepy enough without ghost stories." I was about to agree when it happened again. Definitely laughter this time. Unmistakably human but distorted in a way that made my skin crawl. It seemed to come from multiple directions at once, bouncing between the canyon walls before fading into the oppressive silence. The laughter died away, leaving us staring at each other in the flickering firelight. My heart hammered against my ribs as adrenaline flooded my system. The sound had been too clear, too distinct to dismiss as wind or settling rocks. "Okay, that was definitely not natural," Vincent said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. He stood abruptly, scanning the darkness beyond our fire's reach. "Someone else is out here." Riley grabbed his flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the surrounding rocks and vegetation. The white light revealed nothing but shadows and empty stone. "Hello?" he called out. "Is someone there?" His words echoed back from the canyon walls, but wrong somehow, distorted in ways that made no acoustic sense. The echo seemed to linger too long, taking on qualities that his original shout had never possessed. "Don't," I whispered urgently. "Don't call out again." "Why not?" Ava demanded. She'd moved closer to the fire, holding her hands out toward the flames. "If there are other campers nearby, they might need help. Or maybe they know something about these sounds we're hearing." But every instinct I possessed screamed danger. The stories I'd recounted earlier no longer seemed like harmless folklore. In this place of oppressive silence and strange acoustics, ancient warnings carried new weight. "The stories I mentioned," I said carefully, keeping my voice low. "They specifically warned against responding to voices in the darkness. According to legend, that's how the Echo people hunted, by mimicking familiar sounds to draw people away from safety. Zoe laughed nervously. You're really starting to creep me out. It's just other campers, or maybe... Her words were cut off as her own laughter suddenly echoed back from the darkness, but coming from the wrong direction entirely. Instead of bouncing off the canyon wall behind her, the sound seemed to originate from somewhere high above us, among the jagged rocks near the rim. We all looked up, squinting into the impenetrable blackness beyond our fire's reach. Riley raised his flashlight again, playing the beam across the cliff face. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow that seemed too large and too fluid to be natural rock formations. There, Ava pointed with a trembling finger. Did you see that? The shadow shifted again, seeming to flow like liquid across the vertical stone face. As we watched in horrified fascination, it appeared to detach itself from the cliff entirely, moving laterally across empty air before merging with darkness on the opposite wall. That's impossible, Riley breathed. Shadows don't move like that. But even as he spoke, more movement caught my eye. Multiple shapes now, flowing along the canyon rim like black water. They moved with purpose, positioning themselves at regular intervals around our campsite. Whatever they were, we were being surrounded. Vincent grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh through the fabric of my jacket. We need to leave, right now. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. The logical part of my mind still insisted there had to be a rational explanation. Optical illusions created by firelight and stress, acoustic tricks produced by unusual rock formations. But that rational voice was rapidly being overwhelmed by pure, primal terror. We began gathering our essential gear with forced calm, trying not to attract attention from whatever watched us from above. I kicked dirt onto the fire, reducing it to glowing embers that provided minimal light. In the sudden dimness, the shadows above seemed to grow bolder, flowing closer to the rim where we could see them more clearly. That's when Zoe screamed. The sound ripped through the oppressive silence like a physical blow. But before the echoes could die away, her scream was answered by her own voice, calling from somewhere in the darkness above us. The mimicked cry was perfect in every detail except for an underlying quality of malicious amusement that made my skin crawl. "Oh God," Ava whispered, backing toward the dying fire. "Oh God, that was my voice. That was exactly my voice." More voices joined the chorus now, all of us calling out in perfectly replicated terror, our own words thrown back at us from multiple directions. The acoustics should have been impossible. Sounds were coming from places where no human throat could produce them, distances that should have prevented such clear reproduction. Riley raised his flashlight toward the rim again, and this time the beam caught something that made us all freeze in absolute terror. Silhouetted against the star-filled sky were figures, humanoid in shape but wrong in proportion, limbs too long and movements too fluid. They perched along the canyon rim like grotesque birds, heads turned down toward our camp with predatory attention. "We have to find him," Ava whispered, tears streaming down her face. She kept turning toward each false call as they echoed from the canyon walls, her body language betraying her desperate hope that one might be genuine. "How?" Riley demanded, his voice raw with exhaustion and fear. "How do we find him when we can't trust anything we hear? Those things, whatever they are. They have his voice now. They can lead us anywhere they want." I knew he was right, but the thought of abandoning Vincent felt like surrendering our humanity. We'd been friends since college, had shared countless adventures together. The idea that something had taken him while we stood helpless was almost unbearable. "The ranger station," I said finally. "If Vincent is if he's still alive, he might head there for shelter. It's the only landmark in this area, the only place that offers protection." We continued along the trail, moving more cautiously now. Every shadow could conceal danger. Every sound might be a trap designed to lure us into the darkness. The voices had grown quieter, but hadn't disappeared entirely. Whispered conversations in familiar tones that seemed to come from just beyond the range of our flashlights. The canyon gradually widened as we progressed, the walls becoming less vertical and more stepped. Ahead, I could make out a break in the rock formations that suggested we were approaching the area where the ranger station should be located. According to my map, it was built on a natural shelf about 50 feet above the canyon floor, accessible by a switchback trail cut into the cliff face. There, Zoe pointed with her flashlight beam. Is that it? A structure became visible in the distance, dark and angular against the starlit sky. The building appeared intact despite decades of abandonment, its silhouette suggesting a typical 1940s government construction with clean lines and practical design. No lights showed in any windows, which was expected, but something about the place felt wrong, even at this distance. As we approached the base of the switchback trail, Riley suddenly grabbed my arm. "Listen," he whispered. From somewhere above us, barely audible over the sound of our own breathing, came the soft murmur of conversation. Multiple voices speaking in low tones, the words indistinct but the cadence unmistakably human. My heart leaped with hope. Perhaps Vincent had found the station and encountered other travelers, or maybe a caretaker still maintained the supposedly abandoned facility. But as we climbed the switchback trail toward the sound, my optimism faded. The voices became clearer, and I recognized them with growing horror. Vincent, Ava, Riley, Zoe, and myself, all of us engaged in animated conversation, discussing our plans for the next day, laughing at shared memories, planning future adventures. It was a perfect reproduction of discussions we'd had around the campfire, but edited and rearranged into a new configuration. Our words had been harvested and repurposed, creating the illusion of normalcy where none should exist. The conversation continued as we climbed, always staying just ahead of us, always coming from the direction of the ranger station. "That's us," Ava breathed, her voice barely audible. "That's all of us talking. But we're here, we're not up there. How is that possible?" The trail ended at a narrow ledge where the ranger station perched like a bird's nest against the cliff face. The building was larger than it had appeared from below, a main structure flanked by smaller outbuildings, all connected by covered walkways. Windows stared blindly into the darkness, their glass long since scoured opaque by wind-blown sand. The voices were coming from inside the main building, clearly audible through walls that should have muffled sound. Our conversation continued with disturbing normalcy, discussing weather and trail conditions and the beauty of the desert landscape. But listening to it, I noticed subtle wrongness in the phrasing, words combined in ways we'd never actually spoken them. Riley approached the station's front door, his flashlight revealing a heavy wooden barrier that hung slightly ajar. The voices inside didn't pause or react to our presence, continuing their artificial dialogue with mechanical persistence. "Vincent," Riley called softly, "are you in there?" The conversation inside stopped instantly, replaced by perfect silence. Then, clear as if he were standing beside us, Vincent's voice responded, "Come inside. It's safe in here. I found supplies." But something in the tone felt off. Too eager, too confident for someone who'd just been separated from his friends in a place where unnatural predators hunted with stolen voices. I grabbed Riley's arm as he reached for the door handle. "That's not him," I whispered urgently. "Listen to the inflection. Vincent never sounds that sure of anything." As if responding to my observation, the voice inside shifted slightly. "Come inside. I think it might be safe in here. I found what might be supplies." The correction was too perfect, too precisely calibrated to Vincent's usual speech patterns. Whatever produced that voice had been listening to our conversations. learning our individual quirks and habits, becoming more sophisticated in its mimicry. We backed away from the door, and immediately the building erupted with voices, all of us calling from multiple rooms, pleading for help, describing injuries and discoveries, creating a symphony of false urgency designed to overwhelm our ability to think clearly. But through the chaos, I heard something else, a sound that definitely wasn't voice mimicry. From somewhere inside the station came a rhythmic scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood, or claws being sharpened against stone. The sound was patient, methodical, and utterly inhuman. Whatever waited inside the ranger station, it wasn't Vincent. We retreated to the far edge of the ledge, as far from the station as the narrow space allowed. The voices inside had grown more frantic, calling to us with increasing desperation as if sensing our withdrawal. But beneath the familiar sounds of our stolen words, that rhythmic scraping continued, a sound no human throat could produce. "We need to get out of here," Zoe whispered, edging toward the trail that led back down to the canyon floor. "This place is wrong. Everything about it is wrong." I couldn't argue with her assessment. The station itself seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its dark windows like eyes watching our every movement. The voices inside had begun to overlap and blend, creating conversations that never could have occurred, blending our words into new configurations that felt like violations of our very identities. But as we prepared to descend, Riley's flashlight caught something that made us all freeze. Carved into the wooden doorframe, barely visible in the weathered wood, were symbols that looked disturbingly familiar. They matched the petroglyphs we'd seen throughout the canyon. The same primitive spirals and angular figures that had decorated the cliff faces for centuries. "Someone carved those recently," Riley observed, his beam highlighting the fresh cuts in the old wood. "Look how clean the edges are. These aren't ancient petroglyphs." A horrible possibility began to form in my mind. What if the ranger station hadn't been abandoned because of budget cuts or technological advancement? What if Garrett Stevens, the ranger who died here in 1978, had discovered something about this place? What if his death hadn't been a heart attack, but something far more sinister? From inside the building, Vincent's voice called out again. "I found his journal. Stevens kept records of everything. You need to see this." The words carried conviction and urgency that would have been convincing under normal circumstances. But we'd learned to distrust everything in this place where sound itself had become unreliable. "Even if Vincent really is in there," I said quietly, "we can't risk it. Those things can mimic him perfectly now. We'd never know if we were walking into a trap." Ava sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking with suppressed grief. "We can't just leave him. He's our friend." "He might already be gone," Riley said with brutal honesty. "And if we go in there, we might join him." The scraping sound intensified, joined by others. Footsteps that seemed to come from above the ceiling, scratching that might have been claws against glass. Sounds that belonged to no creature I could identify. The station had become a nexus of wrongness, a place where the natural laws that governed sound and motion seemed suspended. We began our descent back to the canyon floor, moving as quickly as the treacherous path allowed. Behind us, the voices in the station grew more desperate, cycling through every combination of our words in increasingly frantic attempts to lure us back. They called about discoveries and safety and urgent warnings, playing on every possible motivation that might compel us to return. But as we reached the bottom of the trail, a new sound made us stop in our tracks. From somewhere ahead, echoing down the canyon from the direction we'd been traveling, came the unmistakable sound of Vincent calling for help. Not the artificial mimicry we'd grown accustomed to, but something that carried the genuine terror and exhaustion of someone in mortal danger. "That's really him," Ava breathed, her face lighting with desperate hope. "I can tell the difference. That's Vincent's real voice." I listened carefully, trying to distinguish between authentic and artificial sounds in a place where such distinctions had become meaningless. The call did seem different, rougher, more emotional, carrying overtones of genuine distress that the mimicked voices had lacked. But it could also be an evolution in the hunting strategy, a refinement of technique that made the false voices more convincing. In this place where our enemies learned with each passing hour, how could we trust anything? The call came again, fainter now, as if Vincent were moving away from us deeper into the canyon. If it was really him, we were losing our chance to help. If it was a trap, we were being drawn exactly where something wanted us to go. We follow, I decided, though the words felt like a death sentence. But we stay together, and we don't trust anything we hear completely. If this is Vincent, we help him. If it's a trap, at least we face it together. We set off into the deeper canyon, following the sound of what might have been our friend's voice calling from the darkness ahead. The walls around us seemed to grow taller and more oppressive with each step, channeling us toward whatever waited in the black heart of this cursed place. Behind us, the ranger station fell silent at last. Not the natural quiet of an empty building, but the expectant stillness of a predator that had finished one hunt and was already anticipating the next. The canyon narrowed as we pressed deeper into its recesses, the walls closing in until we could touch both sides with outstretched arms. Our flashlights revealed smooth rock surfaces polished by millennia of flash floods, creating an almost tunnel-like passage that amplified every sound and twisted every echo. Vincent's calls had stopped 20 minutes ago, leaving us to navigate by memory and hope through a landscape that seemed designed to confuse and disorient. Side passages branched off at irregular intervals, each one potentially hiding danger or leading to dead ends that could trap us far from any escape route. "How much further?" Zoe asked, her voice tight with exhaustion. We'd been walking for hours now, fueled by adrenaline and terror, but human endurance had its limits. I checked my watch, 3:47 a.m. Dawn was still hours away, and we'd already covered more ground than should have been possible in this difficult terrain. Either we were moving faster than I'd realized, or the canyon was larger than any map had indicated. Riley suddenly stopped, holding up a hand for silence. "Do you hear that?" At first, there was only the usual oppressive quiet that characterized this place. But as we stood motionless, listening intently, I began to make out a new sound, rhythmic and mechanical, completely unlike anything we'd encountered so far. "Helicopter?" Ava suggested hopefully. But the sound was wrong for aircraft, too regular, too mechanical, like machinery running in a steady cycle. It echoed from somewhere ahead, bouncing off the canyon walls in ways that made it impossible to determine the exact source or distance. We rounded a sharp bend and found ourselves in a wider chamber where the canyon briefly opened up. The sound was much clearer here, definitely mechanical, accompanied by what might have been electronic beeping. In the center of the chamber, barely visible in our flashlight beams, stood a small structure that hadn't appeared on any of my maps. As we approached, I realized we were looking at some kind of monitoring station, solar panels, antenna arrays, and electronic equipment housed in a weatherproof enclosure. The machinery hummed quietly, LED indicators blinking in regular patterns that suggested active operation. "What is this place?" Riley asked, examining the equipment with his flashlight. "This stuff looks modern. Someone's maintaining it." I found a metal plaque attached to the enclosure, its surface etched with official government markings and a date from just 2 years ago. According to the inscription, this was a seismic monitoring station operated by the United States Geological Survey, part of a network designed to track earthquake activity throughout the region. "Seismic monitoring," I read aloud. "They're measuring ground movement, probably looking for signs of geological instability." But something about the placement bothered me. Seismic stations were typically located in accessible areas where maintenance crews could service them regularly. This location, deep in an unmapped canyon, seemed designed for secrecy rather than scientific convenience. Ava had found a small maintenance access panel, its cover secured with a simple latch. Should we look inside? Maybe there's a radio or something we could use to call for help. Before I could answer, the equipment suddenly went silent. All the blinking lights stopped, the electronic beeping ceased, and the mechanical humming died away. In the sudden quiet, we could hear something else, footsteps approaching from the direction we'd just come. "Someone's following us," Zoe whispered, backing away from the monitoring station. But the footsteps were wrong. Too many of them. Too synchronized. Like a small army marching in perfect formation. As they grew closer, I could make out other sounds mixed in with them. The scraping we'd heard at the ranger station, clicking noises that might have been claws on stone, and underneath it all, the soft murmur of voices engaged in quiet conversation. Our voices, speaking words we'd never said in combinations that felt like blasphemy against human speech. "Run!" I commanded, and we fled deeper into the canyon. The passage began to climb now, winding upward through a series of natural steps carved by ancient water flow. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit grew louder and more numerous, as if every shadow we'd encountered throughout the night had finally converged on our location. My legs burned with exhaustion. My lungs struggled to process the thin desert air. But terror drove us onward. Gradually, the canyon walls began to lower, and I caught glimpses of stars overhead that suggested we were approaching the rim. "Look!" Ava gasped, pointing ahead. The passage opened onto a natural amphitheater carved into the canyon's end, a circular chamber surrounded by towering walls that rose to meet the desert floor above. And scattered throughout the chamber, barely visible in our failing flashlight beams, were structures. Not buildings exactly, but arrangements of stone and metal that suggested intelligence and purpose. Some were clearly ancient, circles of standing stones that matched descriptions I'd read of prehistoric ceremonial sites. Others were more recent, metal poles arranged in geometric patterns, electronic equipment similar to what we'd found at the monitoring station. But most disturbing were the newest additions. Symbols carved into the chamber walls that I recognized as variations of the petroglyphs we'd seen throughout the canyon. Except these were fresh, the cuts clean and precise, arranged in patterns that seemed to pulse with meaning just beyond my comprehension. "This is where they bring them," a voice said behind us. We spun around to find Vincent standing at the entrance to the chamber, his clothes torn and dirty, his face gaunt with exhaustion. But his eyes were wrong, too bright, too knowing, reflecting light in ways that human eyes shouldn't. "Vincent?" Ava called tentatively. He smiled, and his teeth gleamed white in the darkness. "They've been collecting voices for decades. Every person who's disappeared in this area, every hiker who never made it home, they're all here, preserved in the walls of this place." As he spoke, I noticed that his words didn't quite match the movement of his lips. The sound seemed to come from somewhere else entirely, as if Vincent's body were just a shell for something else to inhabit. Garrett Stevens understood. Vincent continued, his voice gaining strength and confidence. "That's why he stayed at the ranger station for so long. He was documenting them, learning their patterns, until they learned his." The footsteps we'd been fleeing finally caught up with us, and shapes began to emerge from the passage behind Vincent. They moved with fluid grace across terrain that should have challenged any living creature, their forms shifting and changing as they approached. But as they entered the chamber, I realized they weren't entirely inhuman. Some retained recognizable features, faces that might once have belonged to missing hikers, voices that carried echoes of people who'd vanished in this wilderness over the years. "Welcome," Vincent said, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of greeting. "Welcome to the collection." Above us, the eastern sky began to show the first faint traces of dawn, A pale glow that promised sunrise was only an hour away. But in this deep chamber surrounded by towering walls, that light seemed impossibly distant. The pale pre-dawn light filtering down into the chamber revealed the true horror of our situation. The walls around us were covered with carvings, not just the ancient petroglyphs I'd studied, but newer additions. Names, dates, and symbols that documented decades of disappearances in this remote wilderness. Among them, I recognized some entries from missing person reports I'd researched while planning our trip. Hikers who'd vanished without a trace, their cars found abandoned at trailheads with no indication of where they'd gone. Now I understood. They'd all ended up here, in this collection chamber, where their voices became part of something vast and hungry. The things that had pursued us through the night gathered in a loose circle around the chamber's perimeter. In the growing light, I could see them more clearly. Humanoid shapes that wore faces and features like masks, shifting and changing their appearance with fluid ease. Some I recognized as people we'd encountered during our hike. Others seemed to be composites of multiple individuals. "The Echo people," I whispered, finally understanding the legends I'd so carelessly shared around our campfire. Vincent, or the thing wearing Vincent's appearance, nodded approvingly. The P.28 understood this place. They knew it was alive, that it fed on human voices and memories. They stayed away, warned others to avoid it, but modern people don't listen to old stories. Ava pressed close to me, her body trembling with terror and exhaustion. "What do you want from us?" "Your voices," Vincent replied with mechanical precision. "Your words, your memories, your patterns of speech. We preserve them here, keep them safe from the entropy that claims all human things." The light grew stronger overhead, and I noticed that the gathered shapes seemed less solid now, more translucent. Their borrowed features flickered and shifted as if the approaching dawn was interfering with their ability to maintain consistent forms. "You're afraid of daylight," I realized with sudden hope. Vincent's expression didn't change, but several of the other shapes began to retreat toward darker areas of the chamber. "Sunlight disrupts the resonance patterns, makes it harder to maintain cohesion." "That's why you only hunt at night," Riley said, understanding flooding his voice. "You can't function properly in full daylight." The false Vincent smiled, but the expression seemed forced now, requiring effort to maintain. "Dawn comes every day, but it also goes. We have patience that outlasts any human lifespan." But even as he spoke, cracks appeared in his facade. His voice began to waver, shifting between Vincent's familiar tones and something else entirely. Multiple voices speaking in unison, words overlapping and blending into inhuman syllables. Above us, the sky continued to brighten. The first direct rays of sunlight struck the chamber's eastern wall, illuminating the carved symbols with golden light. Where the sun touched them, the newer carvings began to smoke and blur, as if the light was erasing them. The assembled shapes retreated further, clustering in the shadows near the chamber's base. Their borrowed forms flickered more rapidly now, cycling through different faces and bodies with increasing desperation. "The collection," Vincent said, his voice now clearly artificial, mechanical in its precision. "The collection must be preserved." But I could see dissolution beginning at the edges of his form. The approaching dawn was breaking whatever force allowed these things to maintain their borrowed identities, revealing the true nature of what lurked in this cursed place. "Now!" I shouted to my friends. "While they're weakening." We ran toward the chamber's eastern wall where the first rays of sunlight offered a narrow path of safety. Behind us, the shapes howled with voices that belonged to dozens of missing people. A chorus of the lost crying out in anguish as daylight destroyed their borrowed existence. The chamber's wall offered handholds and ledges, a natural stairway that led toward the surface. We climbed desperately, racing against the Echo people's attempts to stop us before the sun could complete their disruption. Claws scraped against stone behind us, Inhuman sounds of rage echoed from below, but the pursuing shapes grew weaker with each passing minute. By the time we hauled ourselves over the rim and onto the desert floor above, full daylight had claimed the sky. We collapsed on the sun-warmed sand, gasping and sobbing with relief. Behind us, the chamber had fallen silent, not the oppressive quiet we'd experienced throughout the night, but the natural peace of an empty place. But as we walked toward our distant car, I couldn't shake the memory of those carved names on the chamber walls. Garrett Stevens had tried to document this place, tried to understand and perhaps contain it. His failure had cost him his life, but his warnings remained for anyone willing to listen. I never reported what happened to Vincent. How could I explain that he'd been taken by something that shouldn't exist, in a place that maps claimed didn't exist? Instead, I filed reports about a hiking accident, a fall in treacherous terrain that had claimed our friend's life. The nightmares started immediately after our return to civilization. Not dreams of monsters or supernatural terrors, but something worse. The sound of Vincent's voice calling to me from dark places, pleading for rescue that would never come. Because somewhere in that chamber beneath the canyon rim, his voice lived on as part of the collection, preserved forever in a hell of stolen words and borrowed memories. I've never returned to the desert, never again sought out remote places where ancient warnings might carry weight. Some silences are meant to be respected. Some stories are meant to be heeded rather than dismissed as folklore. But sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I hear echoes that shouldn't exist. Familiar voices speaking words they never said, calling from distances that can't be measured in miles. The collection grows, patient and hungry, waiting for the next careless visitors to venture into places where human voices become currency for things that should not be. And in those moments, I remember Vincent's final lesson, that some prices are too high to pay, and some places are too dangerous to explore, no matter how compelling their mysteries might seem. I never thought of myself as the kind of guy who'd get lost in the middle of nowhere, especially not on a simple weekend road trip. But that's exactly what happened to me that fateful autumn day in 2016. I've always loved taking backroads journeys when I had a few days off from my hardware store job. It was my escape, a chance to explore parts of the country most folks don't even know exist. The plan this time was straightforward enough. Drive down to Kentucky, spend a couple days catching up with my buddy Rick at his place in the hills, grill some steaks, drink a few beers, then head back home to Indiana. Easy peasy. Or so I thought. My first mistake was taking the wrong highway exit in my hurry to beat the evening traffic. I'd driven this way before to visit Rick, but somehow I ended up on an unfamiliar gravel road that soon turned into more of a rutted dirt path. No big deal, I figured. I had time and wasn't in a rush. Surely this backwoods route would loop around and spit me back out onto a main road eventually. But as the sun began its slow dip below the treetops, my confidence started to waver. The dense Kentucky woods pressed in close on both sides of the narrow lane, tall pines and gnarled oaks forming a claustrophobic tunnel. An eerie quiet hung in the air, broken only by the crunch of my tires and the whisper of a chill breeze through browning leaves. Not even a bird call broke the stillness. Then, as if on cue, my trusty old pickup truck sputtered, coughed, and coasted to a dead stop, the engine cutting out completely. I muttered a few choice words as I turned the key desperately back and forth. No luck. I'm no mechanic, but I know my way around an engine. Popping the hood, I poked around, hoping for a quick fix. But everything looked in order to my untrained eye. No cell signal either, of course. Par for the course this far out in the sticks. With a sinking feeling, I surveyed my limited options as the shadows lengthened. I could sit tight with the truck and hope some local would happen by. Or I could strike out on foot, flashlight in hand, praying I'd stumble across a farmhouse or ranger station before full dark. In the moment, walking seemed the less terrible choice. I mean, people did live out here in the boondocks, right? Locking up the pickup, I set off down the path at a brisk clip, fallen leaves scuffing under my boots, the beam of my flashlight dancing through the underbrush. Ahead, the dirt track twisted and turned, drawing me deeper into the darkening forest. Minutes stretched into an hour, then more. No sign of civilization, not even a damn squirrel. Just the trees, the gathering dusk, and a growing unease prickling at the back of my neck. I was debating turning back to the cold comfort of my truck when I spotted it through the gloom. A house. Well, the dilapidated remains of one anyhow. I approached cautiously, picking my way through waist-high weeds. The place was clearly long abandoned, its roof partially caved in, windows busted out, the rotting porch steps groaning ominously underfoot. Still, I had to check. Maybe I'd get lucky and find an ancient landline inside. At this point, I'd take smoke signals if it got me out of this mess. Shouldering open the crumbling front door, I swept my light around what had once been a living room. Water-stained wallpaper peeled above heaps of leaf litter, shattered furniture, and animal scat. A rusted wagon wheel leaned in one corner beside a soot-blackened brick fireplace. Clearly, no one had called this wreck home for decades. I was turning to leave, resigned to my fate, when a floorboard creaked oddly underfoot. Crouching down, I brushed aside a moldy scrap of carpet to reveal a crude trapdoor. A rusted metal ring served as a handle. My gut screamed to leave it the hell alone, but desperate times and all that. Pulse quickening, I heaved the hatch open. Stale, frigid air wafted up from a black gap. Cellar stairs led down into the abyss. Dank stone walls glistened with moisture in my flashlight's wavering glow as I crept down the steps, ducking under cobwebs. A dirt floor, a few broken barrels, some ancient rusted tools. I started to relax. A whole lot of nothing. Then my beam landed on the corner, and my blood turned to ice in my veins. Bones. Human bones, protruding from the damp earth in a dirty pile like a charnel house exhibit. Some looked bleached with age. Others disturbingly fresh, tatters of rotting flesh and fabric still clinging to them. A scream rose up in my throat, but terror throttled it to a choked gurgle. What the unholy hell had I stumbled into? And then, behind me, from the top of the stairs, a floorboard creaked. Sheer animal instinct took over. I hit the flashlight and threw myself into a crouch behind a crumbling stone wall, pulse pounding like a war drum in my ears. Adrenaline surging, I pressed myself against the cold, clammy masonry, barely daring to breathe. On some primal level, my body understood what my mind was still struggling to accept. I wasn't alone down here. And whoever had just crept down those cellar steps had zero intent to offer the welcome wagon. Gripping my extinguished flashlight like a club, my muscles coiled tight, ready to spring into panicked action at the slightest provocation. Seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness as I strained my senses against the suffocating darkness. Shuffling footsteps, moving carefully from the base of the stairwell into the room. The soft scrape of something heavy, metallic, being dragged across the packed dirt floor. A muted thump as an unseen object was set down. Then a voice, barely more than a gravelly whisper, echoing off the stone walls. "Come on out now. I know you're in here." Every hair on my body stood erect at the sound. He knew. Somehow the sick bastard knew I was here, cowering in my hidey hole, a heartbeat away from pissing my pants in terror. Licking bone-dry lips with a sandpaper tongue, I stayed perfectly still, unwilling to confirm my presence until I absolutely had to. A harsh chuckle, utterly devoid of humor. The slow, steady footsteps began circling the cellar's perimeter, drawing steadily closer to my position. "Smell your fear, boy. Smelled it the second you cracked that door." Grimy fingernails dug into the decaying stonework inches from my face as a dark shape loomed around the corner of the wall. I caught a glimpse of ragged clumps of beard, pitted leathery skin, and black holes for eyes that swallowed the scant light. A jagged grin split the feral face as the hulking figure stopped and stared directly at my position. Gotcha. He moved with inhuman speed, a massive paw shooting out to clamp around my windpipe with a grip like iron. I lurched back, gagging, kicking out wildly as I was hauled bodily out from behind the wall. Stars exploded across my vision as I was slammed against the floor, the back of my skull impacting with a sickening crack. Stunned, wheezing, I scrabbled desperately at the gnarled fingers throttling the life from me. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glint of rusted steel. Some corner of my racing mind processed an image of the giant wielding an antique railroad spike, raising it high overhead with clear intent to dash my brains across the cellar floor. Survival instinct surged through my battered body like an electric current. With a wordless bellow of unhinged fear and fury, I twisted like an eel, wrenching to the side just as the crude hammer descended. A line of fire seared across my temple a heartbeat before the spike smashed into the ground, throwing up a spray of dirt. Impossibly, the glancing blow seemed to loosen my attacker's grip for the merest instant. Sucking in a raw, ragged lungful of dank air, I groped out blindly, seizing the first object that came to hand, a heavy, rusted pry bar. Unleashing a crazed howl, I laid into the towering maniac with every ounce of desperate strength left in my battered body. Once, twice, 3 times, I brought the weighty steel bar crashing down, not caring where I struck, just flailing with mindless savagery until I felt the choking press of fingers fall slack from my throat. Rolling sideways, retching and gasping, I fumbled for my flashlight, terrified I'd only stunned the hulking monster. The flickering beam played across a glistening pool of dark blood and a motionless bearded face. One side caved in like a rotten jack-o'-lantern. A final wet rattle escaped from slack lips as clouding eyes stared sightlessly at the earthen ceiling. Shuddering violently, every nerve raw and jangling, I lurched to my feet, swaying like a drunk as I staggered for the stairs. My battered mind reeled, struggling to process the sheer bloody unreality of the last 5 minutes. All I knew was that I had to get out, had to escape this madness before it dragged me down forever. Floorboards shattered under my clumsy stomping boots as I burst into the ruined house above, heedless of the noise. Whimpering like a beaten cur, I made a limping beeline for the sagging front door and what I prayed was a clear path back to the sanity of civilization. I nearly made it too. Would have if my wild, roving flashlight beam hadn't illuminated a half-dozen ragged, dirt-smeared figures emerging from the tree line, all clutching various wicked-looking blades, bludgeons, and farm implements, all wearing the same demonic grins as the thing bleeding out in the basement. A strangled howl of raw animal fear rose unbidden in my chest as they began to lope toward the house. And for a single, oddly lucid instant, one coherent thought crystallized in my fracturing psyche. I was going to die horribly in these god-forsaken woods, and no one would ever find my bones. The mind does funny things when death is bearing down on you at a dead sprint, yellowed teeth bared in a rictus snarl. Time seemed to slow to a molasses crawl as I stood frozen in the doorway of that ramshackle ruin, watching the pack of feral hillfolk close the distance with tendon-stretching strides. In that crystalline moment of pure, ice-cold terror, a deluge of regrets, what-ifs, and unfinished business crashed through my short-circuiting brain with merciless clarity. I saw my mom's face crumpling when the cops arrived to break the news. My kid brother, stoically taking the mantle as man of the house. My dad, already a decade in the ground, silently judging my failures from beyond the pale. Something broke inside me then, some integral pillar of sanity and reason that had been slowly eroding since I first stepped foot on this cursed patch of backwoods dirt. A red haze settled over my vision. A roaring static flooded my ears, and the gagging stench of rancid fear sweat saturated my senses. At the heart of that maelstrom, a spark of defiance flared to life. To hell with this. If I was going out, it wouldn't be as a sniveling victim, If these sick bastards wanted a hunt, I'd give them one they'd never forget. Lips skinning back in a feral snarl of my own, I ripped the flashlight from my belt and sent it sailing end over end into the face of the lead psycho, a wiry, hatchet-wielding fiend covered in ritual scars. The hefty metal cylinder struck with a meaty crunch, pulping the maniac's nose and sending him tumbling backwards with a gurgling howl. The knot of pursuers faltered for a beat, yipping and snarling as they stumbled over their writhing compatriot. I wasted no time in capitalizing on the momentary break. Wrenching around, I kicked the rotting door off its rusted hinges and barreled back into the house's dank interior, vaulting mounds of moldering debris as I plunged deeper into the gloom. Enraged howls and the thunder of stomping feet dogged my heels as I crashed through a rear door into some sort of mudroom or pantry. Animal instinct guided me toward a small, filthy window above a desiccated sink. Seized by a feral desperation, I threw my entire weight behind a shoulder charge, blasting through the decaying wood and showering myself in a hail of splinters and glass shards. I hit the ground outside in a graceless belly flop, the wind exploding from my lungs in a groaning whoosh. Clawing for breath, I jerked to my hands and knees, shaking my head to clear the stars whirling in my vision. In the faint moonlight filtering through the dense branches overhead, I could make out the deep muck of fetid mud I'd landed in, the kind that could steal a man's boots given half a chance. Squelching and struggling, I fought to extricate myself from the clinging morass before my pursuers caught up. The brittle snap of splintering wood and a chorus of baying howls somewhere behind the house told me that my lead had just evaporated. Terror sent a fresh jolt of manic strength surging through my aching muscles as I finally ripped free of the mud's clutches. I took off at a shambling run, crashing haphazardly through the underbrush, thorny branches raking at my face and arms, exposed roots snatching at my ankles. Only blind luck and a moonbeam kept me from braining myself on a low-hanging limb or pitching face first into some hidden ravine. There was no strategy to my mad flight, just a base animal imperative to put as much distance as possible between me and the bloodthirsty freaks stalking my scent. My heart felt like it was about to explode out of my chest, ragged gasps sawing at my raw throat as my burning legs churned relentlessly onward. The howls and screams never faded as I plunged deeper into the lightless tangle of trees and vines. If anything, they seemed to be growing closer, hungrier. My mind spun with visions of grasping claws and flashing blades, of an agonizing, savaged death alone in this dark wood. I don't know how long I ran like that. A blind, stumbling puppet dancing on adrenaline-fueled strings. The forest had swallowed every shred of civilization, even the faintest echo of a distant highway. For all I knew, I was lost in some hellish twilight zone that existed beyond the reach of sane reality. Maybe I'd died back in that rancid cellar after all, and this was my eternal torment. It was the light that finally reached through the delirium and shocked a sliver of awareness back into my animal brain. Golden light spilling from the windows of a small cabin crouched in a clearing ahead. Salvation, shelter, another human being who might just be able to yank me out of this spiraling insanity before those hills gave birth to some fresh horror. A wordless, croaking plea burbled out of my dust-dry throat as I veered toward the beacon of hope. I fixed my eyes on that warm yellow glow, using it to orient my madly spiraling senses as I stumbled into the open ground. Gravel. I felt gravel and cracked asphalt beneath the shredded soles of my boots. A road. An honest-to-God road. And at the end of it, a battered pickup truck parked beside a rough-hewn cabin. I risked a glance over my shoulder, hoping against hope that the change of scenery had somehow thrown my dogged pursuers off the scent. No such luck. Dark, scuttling figures poured from the tree line like a horde of overgrown insects, hooting and baying in a fever pitch of bloodlust. They fanned out in a rough semicircle, cutting off any path of retreat. This was it, the final stand. With the absolute last shred of energy left in my battered frame, I lunged up the cabin's weathered porch steps and began pounding on the front door like a man possessed. Words spilled from me in an incoherent jumble, as much howl as speech. "Help! For the love of God! Help me! They're coming!" From within the rough pine door, the distinctive clack-clack of a shotgun being racked reached my ears. An instant later, the door was wrenched open to reveal a grizzled, wild-haired man in stained overalls, a battered 10-gauge leveled squarely at my chest. Pale blue eyes, sharp as flint, raked me from head to toe, taking in my mud-splattered, blood-streaked form in a single sweep. For a heartbeat, I thought he might pull the trigger on pure reflex. "What in the name of all that's holy?" he started, his voice a low, hawkish rasp. "No time," I gasped out, stabbing a finger back the way I'd come. "They're right behind me. We have to—" A blood-curdling shriek ripped through the night, far too close for comfort. The old man's head snapped up, zeroing in on the threat with a predator's focus. Without a word, he stepped out onto the porch, planting himself at the top of the steps as he raised the shotgun to his shoulder. I scuttled around behind him, instinctively putting his bulk between me and the oncoming horde. Trembling from head to toe, I gripped the weathered railing for support, my heart a jackhammer in my chest. The ragged pack had halted at the edge of the clearing, milling and gibbering in a rough semicircle. They made no move to close the distance. Yet. The old man racked the shotgun's slide with an authoritative clack-clack, the sound like a peal of doom in the charged air. "That's far enough, you degenerate bastards," he growled, his voice pitched to carry. "This here's private property. I'm well within my rights to ventilate anyone who takes another step." A jagged chorus of yips and hisses rippled through the throng, underscored by the scrape of metal and the wet smacks of flesh on flesh. At some unseen signal, the mob began to spread out, slowly fanning to either side of the cabin. Trying to flank us, I realized with a fresh shock of gut-churning terror. "They're not going to stop," I croaked, my mouth bone dry. "We have to get inside, call for help, something." The old man's shoulders tensed, but he kept the shotgun trained on the center mass of the pack. "Ain't no help to call, son," he said, his voice grim as a reaper's blade. "Phones are down, and the sheriff's an hour away on a good day. We're on our own here." As if to punctuate his point, a figure suddenly detached from the milling horde and came loping up the gravel drive, a rusted scythe held high. The old man tracked the movement with the muzzle of his gun, his finger hovering over the trigger guard. "Last warning," he barked. "Next step's your last." The scythe-wielding maniac threw back his head and loosed a gurgling cackle, ropes of ropey saliva gleaming in the moonlight. Then, with a spine-chilling howl, he charged straight at us, a one-man wave of flashing steel and savage intent. The old man squeezed the trigger. The shotgun roared like a cannon in the confines of the porch. The scythe-wielder's chest blew open like a rotten melon, sending him pinwheeling backwards in a spray of blood and shredded tissue. He hit the ground in a tangled heap and lay still, his limbs twitching spasmodically. The echoes of the blast were still ringing in my ears when the rest of the pack exploded into motion, howling and screaming as they surged forward en masse. The old man worked the slide with grim efficiency, sending blast after blast into the seething tide of bodies. Gouts of blood misted the night air, mingling with the stench of cordite and burning powder. But there were too many, coming too fast. A thrown hatchet clanged off the porch railing inches from my face, sending me reeling back with a yelp. Another stuck quivering in the cabin's doorframe, its haft still vibrating from the force of the impact. "Inside now," the old man roared, backpedaling furiously as he slapped a fresh shells into the breach. "Bar the door and pray to whatever God you believe in." I didn't need to be told twice. Throwing my weight against the heavy pine, I shouldered it open and all but fell into the cabin's dimly lit interior. A heartbeat later, the old man backed through the opening, still peppering the front yard with buckshot as he crossed the threshold. Together we rammed the door shut and drove home a massive iron bolt just as the first bodies slammed against it from the other side. The aged timbers groaned under the impact, but held fast. For the moment, at least. Chest heaving, I sagged against the rough-hewn wall, my mind reeling as it tried to process the sheer, unmitigated insanity of the last few minutes. The old man was already moving, rummaging through a battered sideboard with quick, efficient motions. "Catch," he said, tossing me a scratched walnut handle protruding from a cracked leather holster. I caught the object reflexively, my hand closing around the grip of a massive revolver that looked old enough to have come west with Wyatt Earp. Ever shot a gun before? The query was punctuated by a meaty thud as something heavy slammed against the door, setting the hinges to creaking. "Once or twice," I managed, my voice sounding thin and thready to my own ears. I fumbled with the latch on the holster, my blood-slicked fingers clumsy on the stiff leather. "Good. Because unless I miss my guess, we're about to have us a regular Alamo situation here." As if on cue, the cabin's lone window shattered inward in a spray of glass shards and splintered wood. A grasping claw-like hand thrust through the opening, groping blindly in the dim light. And the night erupted into a cacophony of gunfire, screams, and shattering wood. Time blurred into a red-tinged fog of adrenaline and cordite as we fought tooth and nail to keep the ravening horde at bay. The old man moved with the fluid grace of a much younger fighter, his shotgun roaring like the wrath of an angry god. I did my best to follow his lead, the massive revolver bucking and leaping in my white-knuckled grip as I sent round after heavy round into the press of bodies. We worked in desperate tandem, one of us laying down a withering barrage as the other reloaded, trading off as the situation demanded. But for every frothing psychopath we put down, two more seemed to surge forward to take their place, heedless of the carnage we were dealing to their ranks. Splintered wood and shattered glass soon carpeted the floor, crunching underfoot as we wove a frantic dance between the cabin's makeshift choke points. Blood painted the walls in violent Jackson Pollock spatters, its cloying coppery tang mingling with the acrid reek of gun smoke and raw terror sweat. Time and again the ragged mob almost breached our crumbling defenses, only to be driven back at the last possible second by a point-blank blast of buckshot or a desperately placed pistol round. But each surge took its toll, sapping our already waning reserves of ammunition and willpower. The creeping realization of our own mortality hung thick as grave dirt in the air. I was in the process of fumbling a handful of shells into the shotgun's smoking breech when the old man abruptly stiffened, his head cocking at an odd angle. For a beat I thought he'd been hit, but then I registered the shocking absence of sound from outside the splintered walls. The furious din of the assault had petered out like someone thrown a switch, leaving only the ragged rasp of our labored breathing and the tinny whine of my adrenaline-jacked ears. What's happening?" I croaked, my voice rough as shattered glass from all the shouting and gun smoke. "Why'd they stop?" The old man shook his head, his expression unreadable in the guttering light of the cabin's single remaining lantern. With a Herculean effort, he levered his bulk over to one of the shot-out windows and chanced a quick peek through the jagged opening. I saw his shoulders slump a fraction before he turned back to me. "They're gone." 2 words, spoken with the leaden finality of a coffin lid slamming shut. I stared at him in naked incomprehension, my mind struggling to wrap itself around the concept. It didn't seem possible, not after the relentless, almost preternatural ferocity of the assault we'd just endured. "What do you mean, gone?" I demanded, an edge of hysteria creeping into my voice. "They were just trying to tear us apart with their bare hands, and now they're, bored? This doesn't make any—" I trailed off as my sluggish brain finally processed the silvery quality of the light filtering through the cabin's ruptured walls. Dawn. Somehow, impossibly, we'd managed to hold out until sunrise. The night's horrors were over, banished by the first pale rays of the coming day. A sound halfway between a sob and a laugh bubbled up my raw throat as I sagged back against the blood-spattered wall. We'd made it. Against all odds and in defiance of all sane reason, we'd weathered the devil's own storm. I looked over at the old man, intending to share in this moment of bone-deep relief, only to pull up short at his grim expression. "They'll be back," he said flatly, his flinty eyes meeting my own haunted gaze without flinching. "Maybe not tonight or the next, but they'll come again. They always do." Something in his voice, some undefinable quality of weary resignation, told me he was speaking from bitter, hard-won experience. This wasn't the first time he'd stared down the abyss and watched it blink. Probably wouldn't be the last either. Suddenly exhausted beyond all reckoning, I let the revolver slip from my nerveless fingers and clatter to the blood-slicked floor. 1,000 questions whirled through my head, each more urgent and unanswerable than the last. What the hell were those things out there? How long had they been stalking these woods, preying on the unwary and the lost? And most importantly, what did we do now? But those were worries for another time, another place. Now, as the first golden rays of the morning sun crept across the porch, all I could think about was putting as many miles between me and this accursed stretch of backwoods as my battered truck could manage. The old man seemed to read my intent in my haunted 1,000-yard stare. Slinging the shotgun over his shoulder, he reached out and clasped my shoulder in a grip that was half comradely, half ominous portent. "You'll be back too," he said, his voice a low, prophetic rumble. "This place, it gets in your blood, under your skin. Calls to you when you lay down to sleep at night. You'll see." Then, with a final nod that could have meant anything, he turned and limped off into the brightening day, leaving me alone with the cooling corpses and the echoing report of gunfire still ringing in my ears. Somehow, I found the strength to stagger out to my truck, slumping behind the wheel like a puppet with its strings cut. The old Ford started up on the first try, its throaty rumble the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. Gravel sprayed from beneath the tires as I wrenched the wheel around, aiming the hood at the distant promise of civilization and sanity. And as I watched the cabin recede in my rearview mirror, the road rolling away beneath my wheels like a coiled strap, a single thought crystallized in my battered psyche with the force of irrational conviction. The old man was right. I would be back. Maybe not today, maybe not for years to come. But someday, when the nightmares had faded and the scars had healed, I would return to this dark place of blood and terror. Because in some sick, twisted way, it had become a part of me, a festering splinter of madness lodged in my very soul. And no amount of miles or sunrises could ever pry it loose. The road beckoned, 2 endless lines of weathered asphalt reaching into a future I could no longer see. And like a moth drawn helplessly to an open flame, I bore down on the gas pedal and drove, chasing a horizon stained forever crimson in my mind. The dense Oregon forest closed in around me as I hiked deeper into the wilderness, following the faint trail on my GPS. When I applied for this secret government job, I never imagined it would bring me to the remote corners of the country, facing unknown dangers. But the steady paycheck was too tempting to pass up given my mounting debts and financial struggles back home in city. I thought back to the strange briefing before this mission. My superiors spoke in ominous tones about the disappearances that plagued these woods, local residents and hikers vanishing without a trace over the decades. The reports were eerily similar to old native folklore about people being led astray by malevolent forest spirits, never to be seen again. As a rational person, I chalked the stories up to natural causes like animal attacks or people simply getting lost. Still, an inexplicable sense of dread settled over me as I ventured further from civilization. The sun dipped below the treetops and I quickened my pace, eager to make camp before nightfall. In the fading light, I spotted a weathered sign nailed to a tree. Turn back. The hairs on my neck stood up. Probably just paranoid locals, I told myself, pushing ahead until I reached the coordinates I'd been given. I set up my small tent and built a fire, but dark shadows danced at the edges of the flickering light. Whispered voices carried on the wind, or maybe it was just my imagination. Fatigue from the long trek finally overpowered my nerves and I drifted into a restless sleep. I awoke with a start, but it took a moment to figure out why. Then I heard it again, a blood-curdling scream in the distance. I grabbed my pistol and flashlight and cautiously peered out of the tent. Scanning the surrounding forest, I saw nothing but the dim flicker of my dying campfire. The scream echoed through the woods again, closer this time, followed by a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. Every instinct told me to run, but I had a job to do. With a deep breath, I chambered around and stepped out to face the horrors that lurked in the shadows. I barely slept after the terrifying sounds in the night. At first light, I broke camp, wanting to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was out there. Trusting my GPS, I hiked deeper into the uncharted forest. As a Marine lieutenant, I was trained for combat. But this felt different. Fighting insurgents in the Middle East, the enemy was clear. Out here, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes. The forest had an oppressive atmosphere, like something ancient and evil permeated the very soil underfoot. I thought back to the old native legends, and a chill ran down my spine. Still, I had to stay focused on the mission. 5 locals had gone missing in this area over the past month. The secret task force I worked for, known only as Unit 13, was called in to investigate when the disappearances defied explanation. Publicly, the government denied our existence. But behind the scenes, we handled the cases too strange and disturbing for normal law enforcement. I came to a ravine slicing through the forest floor, with a fraying rope bridge spanning the gap. On the far side, a glint of color caught my eye. I crossed the bridge, ignoring the creaking wood and swaying under my feet. There, snagged on a bush, was a torn shred of bright blue fabric, the same color worn by one of the missing hikers. My heart raced as I bagged the potential evidence. I was scanning the area for other clues when I heard the snap of a branch behind me. I whirled around, my gun aimed at nothing. Then I noticed the footprint in the mud, far too large to be human. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and I grabbed the trunk of a nearby tree to steady myself. Something was very wrong with this forest. I thought of the missing people and knew I was their only hope of being found. Taking a deep breath, I collected myself and moved deeper into the woods. The day grew darker as storm clouds gathered overhead. The thick canopy blocked what little light penetrated the ominous sky. Even with my flashlight, I could barely see the faint trail winding through the dense undergrowth. Without warning, the heavens opened up. Rain pounded the leaves and thunder rumbled in the distance. Soaked to the bone, I spotted the entrance to a small cave and ducked inside, relieved to be out of the deluge. As I caught my breath, my eyes adjusted to the gloom. The cave walls were carved with primitive drawings. Human figures contorted in agony as they were attacked by huge, twisted creatures. An involuntary shudder ran through me as I wondered if the drawings were the product of some ancient nightmare or based on a horrifying reality. I pulled out my satellite phone, hoping to update HQ on my progress, but the device displayed an error message. No signal. Of course, I was on my own out here. Suddenly, heavy footsteps sounded at the mouth of the cave, coming closer. I pressed myself against the cold stone wall, pistol aimed at the entrance with shaking hands. A hulking silhouette filled the opening, then stepped into the dim light. It was a bear, the largest I'd ever seen. It reared up on its hind legs, towering over me, and let out a deafening roar that reverberated off the stone walls. I pulled the trigger, and a deafening shot rang out. The bear staggered, then dropped to the ground with a massive thud. My ears rang in the silence that followed. I prodded the unmoving bear with my boot, amazed that a single shot had taken down such a beast. Then, as I examined the carcass, my blood turned to ice. The bear's fur was matted with sticky, coagulated blood. It had already been dead before it attacked. I backed away slowly, then turned and ran headlong into the storm, desperate to escape the cave. Lightning flashed as I fled back to the narrow trail, but my mind reeled, trying to comprehend what I'd just witnessed. What ungodly power could reanimate a dead creature? I thought of the ancient drawings, and a terrifying certainty gripped me. There was something in these woods far more dangerous than any bear. The rain finally slowed to a drizzle as night fell. I'd made camp near a rocky outcropping that provided some shelter from the elements and any nocturnal predators. With the adrenaline from my encounter with the undead bear still coursing through me, I doubted I'd be able to sleep. I pulled out my waterproof notebook and flipped through the missing persons files, searching for any detail I might have overlooked. The most recent disappearance had been a week ago, a retired schoolteacher named Evelyn Carver. She had been out foraging for mushrooms when she vanished. Search parties had found no trace of her. As I studied Evelyn's photo, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond the dim glow of my fire. I grabbed my pistol, wondering if another possessed animal had picked up my scent. I strained my ears but heard nothing else. Still, the feeling of being watched made the hair on my neck stand up. Unable to shake the sense of impending danger, I kicked dirt over the fire, plunging my camp into darkness. I crouched behind the rocks with my gun and flashlight ready. An eternity seemed to pass. Then rustling came from the bushes across the clearing. I flipped on my flashlight and nearly screamed. In the stark beam of light was a face, or what was left of one. Gray, mottled flesh sagged off the skull. Worms writhed in the empty eye sockets. Worst of all, shreds of bright blue fabric hung off the desiccated body. It was the missing hiker whose torn clothing I'd found caught on the bush earlier that day. He shambled into the clearing, dragging a decomposing leg behind him at an unnatural angle. The corpse opened its mouth, and a hissing breath wheezed out from the hole where its throat had rotted away. My mind reeled as I tried to process the horror before me. This was no natural creature of the forest, reanimated by a lightning strike like the bear. The hiker had been dead far too long. His fatal wounds, the slashes across his neck and chest, were clearly from no animal. Something had ripped him apart, and now he'd returned as a monstrous revenant. I aimed my pistol at the abomination with trembling hands, then squeezed the trigger. The bullet tore through the forehead with a sickening crunch. The creature crumpled to the forest floor. I stared in shock at the motionless heap of necrotic flesh and bone. I'd seen combat, witnessed death up close, but nothing could have prepared me for this. I glanced again at Evelyn's photo, a dizzying realization taking hold. If the missing hiker had been transformed into a murderous wraith, had the others suffered the same grisly fate? Were they still out there, roaming the woods thirsting for innocent blood? Icy sweat dripped down my back despite the chill in the air. I had to warn the other search parties combing the forest for the lost. But would they believe me? Or would they think I'd gone mad? After all, Unit 13 specialized in cases that defied rational explanation. I was trained to deal with the paranormal, the things that go bump in the night. But this was something else entirely. And I had a sinking feeling I'd just stumbled into an evil far more ancient and powerful than anything I'd ever known. Morning brought no relief from the nightmare I'd found myself in. Fog as thick as soup blanketed the forest floor. Several times I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, but could never spot the source when I turned to look. Still, the eerie feeling of being watched never left me. I radioed HQ to apprise them of the situation, doing my best to downplay the supernatural horrors. The last thing I needed was for my bosses to declare me unfit for duty and pull me out, abandoning the lost souls still trapped in this accursed place. I requested backup, but command said it would take 48 hours to get another team to my location. I had to survive 2 more nights alone in this hellscape. I forced myself to hike on, despite my near-paralyzing dread. Each missing person might still be out there, their corrupted forms posing a danger to innocent hikers and locals. I had to find them before they could do more harm. I pulled out my GPS tracker, but it kept glitching, the screen flickering as if possessed by an evil spirit. The needle of the magnetic compass spun erratically, refusing to hold a fixed bearing. I resorted to tracking the sun across the sky to orient myself. Pushing through a tangle of underbrush, I found myself at the edge of a large clearing. In the center stood an ancient tree, its trunk twisted with age. Thick roots bulged up from the forest floor, like the limbs of some malformed creature. And in the shadows between them, I glimpsed the corner of a backpack, the same color Evelyn Carver was last seen carrying. I approached the gnarled tree slowly, heart pounding in my chest. The backpack was wedged between 2 massive roots. I pulled it free, noting the dark stains splattering the outside. With shaking hands, I unzipped it and removed the contents. A wallet with Evelyn's driver's license. Trail maps of the area, one of which was speckled with drops of what looked like dried blood. And at the very bottom, a journal. I opened the first page and recognized Evelyn's neat script. She wrote about a strange fog that had enveloped her while she was out mushroom hunting. She became hopelessly disoriented and walked in circles for hours, despite being an experienced outdoors woman. The final entry sent a chill down my spine. "It's the fog," she had scrawled in jagged, desperate letters. "It's alive. It wants to consume me. I'm sorry, John. I should have believed you." I flipped back to the first entry about the fog. The word John caught my eye, and suddenly I knew exactly who Evelyn was. John Carver, a retired ranger living near the forest, had vanished 4 years ago. His disappearance had gone unsolved. Until now. Thunder rumbled overhead as the pieces clicked into place. What if all the missing over the years hadn't gotten lost or fallen victim to wild animals? What if something far more sinister had befallen them? Something that lurked in the fog-shrouded heart of the forest, hungering for human essence? I recalled the research I'd done before setting out. The old native legends that warned of an immortal evil dwelling deep in the woods. Monstrous creatures that could take human form to lure their prey into the fog, where they transformed them into undead abominations, cursed to join their ranks for all eternity. The legends were true, and now Evelyn and the others were part of that hellish realm. I had to get out of here. I had to warn everyone. But as I turned to flee, an icy wall of fog began rolling into the clearing, far too fast to be natural. It surrounded the twisted tree, cutting off my escape. As the mist engulfed me, I felt a paralyzing cold seep into my veins. The gun fell from my frozen fingers as I fought to remain conscious. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was a figure emerging from the fog. At first it looked human. Then I saw its face, the rotting visage of Evelyn Carver. I jolted awake in pitch darkness, my heart jackhammering against my ribs. It took a moment to remember where I was and how I'd gotten here. The fog. Evelyn's reanimated corpse. Then nothing. I fumbled for my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam danced over jagged rock walls. I was inside some kind of natural stone chamber. Roots and tendrils snaked through cracks in the ceiling high above. I must be underground, in a cave system that riddled the mountain like a honeycomb. I replayed my last memory, trying to make sense of what happened. The hypnotic fog had trapped me, and then I swore I'd seen Evelyn's lifeless body shuffling toward me, but that was impossible. My oxygen-starved brain must have conjured the nightmarish vision before I passed out. I'd probably stumbled into the cave entrance in my delirium and collapsed. Staggering to my feet, I checked myself over. Other than some new bruises and a pounding headache, I seemed intact. But my relief evaporated when I spotted the camera mounted on my tactical vest. The blinking red light indicated it was recording. With trembling fingers, I hit playback on the small digital screen and watched the footage of my trek through the woods. The video showed me setting up camp the previous night. Fast forwarding, I watched myself doze off. An hour ticked by on the timestamp. Then my blood ran cold. In the eerie green glow of the night vision, a thick mist seeped into my camp, snaking around my sleeping bag like a living thing. The fog condensed into humanoid shapes, their forms shifting and writhing in unnatural contortions. They gathered around my prone body, skeletal arms outstretched. I must have cried out because the figures snapped their heads toward the camera in perfect unison. Glowing eyes flashed in the darkness. Lipless mouths opened in silent snarls, revealing rows of jagged teeth. The horrors closed in on me, their grasping hands inches from my face. Then the screen went black. I resisted the urge to hurl the camera across the cave. Collapsing against the stone wall, I fought to control my ragged breathing. Those creatures had been real. They'd taken me. Which meant I hadn't wandered into this cave. Something had dragged me here. On cue, a guttural moan echoed through the tunnels, raising every hair on my neck. I snatched up my flashlight and pistol. The pack with my satellite phone and extra ammo was gone. The monsters must have disposed of it to prevent me from calling for help. I considered my options. I could hunker down and hope my team would reach me in time. But I had a feeling the creature's den was not a place I wanted to remain for long. The moaning grew louder, joined by shuffling footsteps and the scraping of something sharp against stone. I made my choice. Steeling myself, I crept toward the tunnel at the far end of the chamber, straining to remember my army training on navigating subterranean passageways. Time to find a way out of this underworld, or die trying. The narrow stone passageway twisted and turned, disorienting me until I lost all sense of direction. I might have been wandering for minutes or hours. Time lost all meaning in the perpetual gloom of the tunnel, broken only by the meager beam of my flashlight. The air grew colder and danker the deeper I ventured. A vague sense of wrongness pervaded the tunnels, as if I'd crossed a threshold into a place where the laws of nature held no sway. I was debating turning back when the passage opened into a vast cavern. I stepped into the enormous cavern, my flashlight barely penetrating the oppressive darkness. The beam played over towering stone formations that rose from the ground like the twisted claws of some gigantic subterranean beast. I had the unnerving sense that I'd entered the monster's lair. Shadows danced at the edges of my light, and I caught flickers of movement in my peripheral vision. But when I whipped the flashlight around, I found only bare rock. Was my fear-addled mind playing tricks, conjuring phantoms in the dark? Or were those shadow things all too real, like the shambling horrors that had dragged me into this abyss? I pulled out my water canteen and took a swig to calm my nerves. But the liquid burned my throat and I doubled over, gagging. A sickly sweet scent filled my nostrils. In my haste to escape the creature's den, I must have grabbed the wrong container, the one where I stored the kerosene for my camp stove. I flung the canteen away in disgust and it clattered across the stone, the sound echoing through the cavern. Hissing whispers erupted in the darkness like a pit of vipers disturbed from slumber. I froze, my heart pounding a staccato beat. Silence fell, so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. The air crackled with tension, like the breath before a scream. Slowly, I panned my flashlight across the cavern. The beam fell upon a crevice in the far wall, and my breath caught in my throat. Something was wedged into the gap in the rock. something that gleamed white in the darkness. I crept closer, dread building in my gut with every step. As I drew near, the object resolved into an unmistakable and horrifying shape, a human skull. Other bones were piled beneath the skull, along with the tattered remains of clothing. The beam of my flashlight glinted off an REI logo on the torn backpack strap tangled around a femur. My knees buckled and I fought down the urge to vomit as I realized what I was looking at, the remains of the missing hikers. They'd been dragged here, just like me, to meet a grisly end as dinner for the insatiable monsters lurking in the darkness. I stumbled back from the grim tableau, my mind reeling. How many innocent souls lay scattered in this dark lair, their final screams echoing unheard through these tunnels? Would I end up just another pile of gnawed bones for the next poor bastard to find? Bile burned the back of my throat, along with the bitter taste of despair. I was outmatched here, a lone soldier with a pistol and a few bullets against an unspeakable horde of horrors straight out of humankind's most primal nightmares. What could one man do against such reckless hate? But then I thought of the missing townsfolk, of Evelyn Carver and her husband John, doomed to wander this netherworld through no fault of their own. If I gave up now, there would be no one left to tell their story, to warn others of the ancient evil that haunted these woods. Taking a shuddering breath, I turned back the way I'd come, my resolve hardening. Hopeless as it seemed, I had to find a way to escape this dank labyrinth, to fight my way back to the surface and the land of the living. I owed it to the dead to survive, to make sure their fates were not forgotten. Shadows writhed hungrily in the cavern behind me as I fled back into the winding tunnels. The whispering grew louder, joined by deranged giggles and inhuman snarls. They knew fresh meat was on the menu tonight. Let them come. If I had to go down fighting, I'd make damn sure I took some of those monsters with me into oblivion. I ran until my lungs burned and my muscles screamed for mercy. But no matter how many twists and turns I took, the tunnels all looked the same, dragging me deeper into an inescapable stone maze. Despair clawed at my mind as I dropped to my knees in exhaustion. The demonic cackling echoed from every direction now, drawing inexorably closer. I wondered if this was how all the other victims had felt in their final moments, lost, alone, hunted by nightmares made flesh. I thought of my little sister back home, of game nights playing video game, and weekends exploring favorite hiking spot. I'd gotten into this line of work to make enough money to support her after Mom passed. She'd be all alone in the world now. Tears blurred my vision and I angrily wiped them away. No, I refused to die sniveling in the dark like a lost child. If I was going out, I'd face it like a soldier, on my feet with my head held high. I leaned on the stone wall as I slowly stood, but instead of hard rock, my hand pressed into empty air. I stumbled through the seemingly solid stone into a small side chamber, as if the wall had been nothing more than a curtain of shadow. Before me stood a familiar sight. The ancient tree stump from the clearing, its roots spreading across the chamber floor. And slumped against the twisted trunk was a figure cloaked in shimmering mist. I approached slowly, my pistol aimed center mass. "Evelyn?" I breathed. "Evelyn Carver?" The figure lifted its head, glowing eyes piercing the fog. When it spoke, the voice was feminine but layered with otherworldly echoes. "Evelyn is gone," it said, "consumed like all the others. Only I remain." The mist fell away, revealing the specter's face. I recoiled in horror and revulsion. It was Evelyn, and yet not. Her once kind features were twisted in an expression of inhuman cruelty and hunger. Her skin looked as ancient as the tree she leaned against, ridged with bark-like scars. "What are you?" I managed to choke out. The creature that had been Evelyn rose to its feet, its movements serpentine and unnatural. "The forest spirits had many names to your kind once. Hide behind, Wendigo, the hungry ones." It prowled toward me slowly, a predator savoring its prey's terror. Your modern world has forgotten the old ways, the blood rituals that kept my kind banished to shadow. But we remember. We've been waiting, gathering our power to rise again. I aimed my gun at the monster's heart, though my hands shook. And the missing people? The thing smiled, exposing brown needle-like teeth. The fog is my doorway. I called to them, drew them to my domain to make them part of me, to help me grow stronger. It lunged at me with blinding speed. I squeezed the trigger. The gunshot boomed in the enclosed chamber, but the bullet passed right through the specter, shattering a stalactite behind it. The monster cackled. Foolish meat thing, no mortal weapon can harm me. It slammed into me with the force of a truck, sending my gun flying. Impossibly strong fingers closed around my throat as it pinned me to the chamber wall. I struggled against its grip, but it was like fighting an oak tree. The monster leaned close, its fetid breath washing over me. Mist began to seep from its mouth, probing toward my nostrils and lips. "Don't fight it," it crooned. "Give in to the fog. Let me in. Let me taste your essence. Soon you'll be part of me too, wandering this realm for all time." The deadly fog pushed into my mouth and nose, filling my lungs with icy cold. I convulsed, feeling it invade my body on a cellular level, leeching away my life force as it converted flesh to mist. As my vision dimmed, my flailing hand brushed the ancient tree stump. A desperate idea ignited in my oxygen-starved brain. I groped until my fingers closed around a thick, sharp shard of wood. With a soundless scream of defiance, I plunged the jagged wooden stake into the monster's chest. The creature howled in unbridled agony and rage, dropping me as it staggered back. The stake protruded from its torso, black ooze spreading across its shirt. "You dare? I am the forest eternal. I cannot be destroyed." But cracks were already racing across its bark-like skin. The specter crumbled like charcoal, dissolving into mist that was sucked back into the shard of ancient wood like smoke drawn into a vacuum. And then, silence. It was over, as quickly as it began. The only evidence of the creature's existence was the stake, and the pile of ash slowly dissipating on the stone floor. I collapsed beside the remains of the tree, my chest heaving as I gulped down air. My head spun with the revelation of what I'd just witnessed, and defeated. The monster had been inextricably linked to this ancient oak, a seed of corruption dwelling in its heartwood for untold centuries, inextricably linked to its life force. The legends had been true. Only wood from the source could banish a forest demon back to its realm. I thought of Evelyn, John, and all the other innocent souls transformed and consumed by that timeless evil. In the end, they'd unwittingly given me the key to their salvation by leading me here, to the center of the monster's dark power. I know this sounds crazy. Hell, if someone had told me this story a week ago, I'd have urged them to up their meds. But I swear on my life that every word is true. There are things lurking in the shadows of our world, horrors from the darkest depths of myth and legend that defy explanation. Monsters that view humanity as cattle, ours to be bled dry by their insatiable hunger. But now I know our myths also hold the key to fighting back, to banishing these nightmares back to the abyss. I called HQ and told them I'd solved the case, that the missing were lost and presumed dead. I didn't dare share the full story, even with my superiors. They'd lock me in a padded room, pump me full of drugs until drool replaced the horrors lurking behind my eyes. No, the burden of this truth would be mine to bear alone, but also the quest to unearth more secrets, more half-forgotten lore on how to combat these ancient evils. I owe it to the victims who saved my life to become humanity's sentinel against the darkness. That is why I'm sharing my story with you now. Because if the legends are awakening, we'll need every mind and every ally in the battles to come. Together, through knowledge and conviction, we can light the shadows and safeguard our world from the hungry ones. It's time to remember what our ancestors knew, because the monsters never truly died. They've just been sleeping, waiting for us to believe in them once again. I was 14 years old during the summer of 2019 when my parents decided to ship me off to California to spend 2 months with my Aunt Carmen and Uncle Gabriel. At the time, I felt like I was being punished for something I hadn't done, torn away from my friends in Arizona just when summer vacation was getting good. But looking back now, 5 years later, I realize that summer changed everything about how I see the world. More importantly, it taught me that some things in this world should never be approached, no matter how curious you might be. My Aunt Carmen had always been the adventurous type in our family. While my parents preferred their air-conditioned comfort and predictable routines, Carmen lived for outdoor experiences. She and Gabriel had moved to Northern California specifically because they loved hiking, camping, and what Carmen called communing with nature. Their 2 kids, my cousins Diego and Sofia, were just as outdoorsy as their parents. Diego was 16 and had been camping since he could walk. Sofia, who was my age, could start a fire faster than most adults could figure out a lighter. The first month of my stay was incredible. We visited all the tourist spots, Universal Studios, where I screamed my way through every roller coaster, Legoland, where even at 14 I found myself amazed by the intricate displays, and SeaWorld, though Carmen made sure to educate me about the ethical controversies surrounding marine parks. But between these big trips, we spent most of our time exploring California's natural wonders. Carmen taught me to identify different types of trees, showed me how to read trail markers, and gradually built up my endurance for longer hikes. It was during the second month that Carmen announced we'd be taking a week-long camping trip to Humboldt Redwood State Park. "You haven't really experienced California until you've stood among the giants," she told me, her eyes lighting up with the same excitement she got whenever she talked about her favorite hiking spots. The plan was to meet up with another family, the Hernandez family, who had been Carmen and Gabriel's friends for over a decade. Esperanza Hernandez was a kindergarten teacher who had an infectious laugh and seemed to know everything about local wildlife. Her husband, Roberto, worked as a park ranger and had secured us a beautiful spot near one of the more remote areas of the park. Their 3 kids ranged from 8 to 15, and Carmen promised me I'd love hanging out with them. The arrangement was that the Hernandez family would stay in a rented cabin while our family would camp in tents about a 10-minute walk into the forest. "Best of both worlds," Carmen explained. "We get the full camping experience, but we have a backup plan if the weather turns bad." The drive up to Humboldt took us through some of the most beautiful landscape I'd ever seen. As we wound through increasingly dense forests, the trees grew taller and more imposing. When we finally entered the park proper, I understood why people traveled from around the world to see these ancient giants. The redwoods towered above us like natural skyscrapers, their massive trunks disappearing into a canopy so thick it blocked out most of the sunlight. Even with the car windows up, I could smell the rich, earthy scent of the forest floor and hear the subtle sounds of a wilderness that had existed long before humans ever set foot in California. We met the Hernandez family at the visitor center, where Roberto gave us an impromptu lesson about redwood ecology, while the kids ran around, already excited to start exploring. Esperanza hugged each of us warmly and immediately started planning meals and activities for the week. "We're going to make sure Andy has the full Northern California experience," she announced, using the nickname my family had called me since childhood. The first 2 days passed in a blur of hiking, campfire cooking, and stories shared between our 2 families. Roberto took us on guided walks through parts of the forest that weren't accessible to regular tourists, pointing out massive fallen logs that had become ecosystems unto themselves, and showing us evidence of the various animals that called the redwoods home. During the day, the forest felt magical and welcoming. Shafts of sunlight would break through the canopy, illuminating patches of ferns and creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere. The kids played hide-and-seek among trees so large that 3 adults holding hands couldn't encircle them. But when night fell, the forest transformed completely. The friendly, majestic giants of daylight became looming shadows that seemed to press in from all directions. Our flashlights, which felt perfectly adequate in the store, seemed pathetically weak against the absolute darkness that settled over the campground. Even with our campfire burning bright, the circle of light felt small and vulnerable against the vast unknown that surrounded us. On our fourth night in the park, we had spent the evening at the Hernandez family's cabin playing board games and eating Esperanza's amazing homemade tamales. Roberto had entertained us with ranger stories, including a few that were probably too scary for the younger kids, but that had us all hanging on every word. The cabin felt warm and safe, filled with laughter and the comfortable noise of two families who had become close friends over the years. As usual, around 10:30, it was time for our family to make the walk back to our campsite. The routine had become familiar over the past few days. Gather our things, turn on our flashlights, and form a small group for the 10-minute trek through the forest. Gabriel always led the way, with Carmen bringing up the rear to make sure nobody got left behind. Diego and Sofia usually stayed together in the middle, chatting about whatever teenagers talk about when adults aren't paying close attention. That night, I was more tired than usual. We had done a particularly challenging hike earlier in the day, covering almost 8 miles of difficult terrain, and my legs felt heavy and unsteady. As we said our goodbyes and stepped out of the warm, well-lit cabin into the cool darkness of the redwood forest, I found myself falling behind the rest of the group almost immediately. The path back to our campsite wasn't particularly difficult. Roberto had shown us the route several times, and we had been walking it for days. But in the darkness, even familiar landmarks became unclear shadows. The massive redwood trunks created natural barriers that blocked our flashlight beams, creating pockets of absolute blackness between islands of weak light. The forest floor, covered in decades of fallen needles, muffled our footsteps but also concealed roots and branches that could easily trip an inattentive walker. I was maybe 50 feet behind the rest of my family, close enough to see their flashlight beams bobbing ahead of me, but far enough that their voices had become indistinct murmurs when I heard it for the first time. Andy. The voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper, and it seemed to come from somewhere behind me and to my left. I stopped walking and turned around, shining my flashlight in the direction I thought I'd heard it. The beam illuminated nothing but massive tree trunks and the endless darkness between them. I stood perfectly still for almost a minute, listening carefully and scanning the area with my light. The forest around me was completely silent. No birds, no insects, no small animals scurrying through the underbrush. Even the wind, which had been creating a gentle rustling in the canopy all evening, seemed to have stopped completely. The silence felt heavy and wrong, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I was about to convince myself that I had imagined the voice when I heard it again, clearer this time and definitely louder. Andy. This time there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was definitely calling my name. The voice sounded like Esperanza, the same warm, slightly accented tone I had been listening to all week. But something about it felt off, like hearing a familiar song played at the wrong speed or seeing a photograph that had been slightly altered in a way you couldn't quite identify. I called out, "Esperanza? Is that you?" My voice cracked slightly, betraying more nervousness than I wanted to admit. "Did we forget something at the cabin?" The response came almost immediately. "Andy, come here." The word sent a wave of uneasiness through my body that I couldn't explain. It definitely sounded like Esperanza, but the tone was wrong. Too flat, too emotionless. In all the time I had spent with the Hernandez family, I had never heard Esperanza speak without warmth and expression in her voice. This sounded like someone trying to imitate her speech patterns without understanding what made her voice distinctive. Despite my growing anxiety, I started walking slowly in the direction the voice had come from. Maybe Esperanza had followed us to return something we had left behind. Or maybe one of the younger kids had gotten scared and she had come to check on us. There were plenty of reasonable explanations, and I didn't want to be rude by ignoring her. "Esperanza, where are you?" I called out, sweeping my flashlight back and forth as I moved deeper into the forest. "I can hear you, but I can't see you." "Andy, keep coming, I'm right here." The voice was closer now, maybe 30 feet ahead of me, but still completely invisible. My flashlight beam seemed to stop short, swallowed up by the darkness in a way that didn't make sense. I had been using the same flashlight for days, and it had never failed to illuminate objects at this distance. That's when I noticed the other wrongness about the voice. Esperanza was calling my name, but she wasn't calling it the way she usually did. All week, she had been pronouncing it with the Spanish pronunciation, Andres, the way my family had always said it. But this voice was using the English pronunciation, flat and sharp in a way that no one in my family ever used. I stopped walking. The wrongness I had been feeling crystallized into genuine fear. "Andy, why did you stop? I'm waiting for you." The voice was definitely closer now, close enough that I should have been able to see whoever was speaking. But my flashlight revealed nothing except the same massive tree trunks and empty darkness. Worse, the voice had developed a strange quality that I can only describe as static, like hearing someone speak through an old radio with poor reception. I stood completely frozen, afraid to move forward, but equally afraid to turn around and run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me that something was terribly wrong, that whatever was calling my name was not Esperanza and was not friendly. The forest around me continued to maintain its unnatural silence, as if every living thing had fled the area. "Andy, come closer. Don't be afraid." The static quality was stronger now, and underneath Esperanza's familiar voice, I could hear something else, a low guttural sound that no human throat could make. It was like hearing two voices speaking in unison, one trying to perfectly mimic human speech, while the other revealed something far more primitive and dangerous. That's when I saw it. At the very edge of my flashlight beam, just barely visible in the darkness, something moved. It was low to the ground, about the size of a large dog, but it moved wrong. The gait was too fluid, too predatory, like an animal that was perfectly adapted for hunting in absolute darkness. "Andy, where are you? I was looking for you and you weren't with the group." This time, the voice came from behind me, and I spun around to see my Aunt Carmen jogging toward me, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she hurried through the forest. The relief I felt at seeing her familiar face was so intense that my knees almost buckled. "Thank God you found me," I said, my voice shaking more than I wanted to admit. I thought I heard Esperanza calling my name, but something was wrong with her voice, and I couldn't find her anywhere. Carmen reached me and immediately took my arm, pulling me back toward the path where Gabriel and my cousins were waiting. "Esperanza? Andy. Esperanza and her family went to bed right after we left the cabin. Roberto mentioned that they were all exhausted from today's hike." As we hurried back toward the rest of our family, I glanced over my shoulder one more time. In the distance, barely visible at the absolute limit of my flashlight's range, I saw something that looked like the hindquarters of a large animal disappearing between the massive tree trunks. But it moved wrong, too fluidly and too quickly for any normal forest animal. The rest of our camping trip passed without incident, but I found myself staying much closer to the group whenever we walked through the forest at night. I told Carmen and Gabriel what had happened, and while they listened with appropriate concern, they seemed to think it had been another camper playing a prank, or possibly just my imagination, heightened by the unfamiliar environment and the natural creepiness of being alone in a dark forest. When we returned to the cabin the next morning, I casually asked Esperanza if she had gone outside the night before. She looked at me with confusion and shook her head. "After you all left, Roberto and I got the kids ready for bed and then watched a movie until we fell asleep." "Why do you ask?" I told her I thought I had heard someone calling my name, but I didn't mention that it had sounded like her voice. Something about the experience felt too personal, too disturbing to share with someone who had been so kind and welcoming to me. Roberto, who had been listening from the kitchen, came over and sat down with us. You know, Andy, the redwood forest can play tricks on people sometimes. The acoustics are strange because of how the trees are positioned, and sounds can carry much farther than you'd expect. You might have heard someone from another campsite, or even just the wind creating noise that sounded like voices. His explanation was reasonable and comforting, and I wanted to believe it. But I couldn't shake the memory of that static-filled voice, or the way the thing I had glimpsed moved through the darkness with such predatory grace. For the next 4 years, I told the story occasionally to friends who enjoyed scary tales, always presenting it as a strange but probably explainable experience from a family camping trip. I had convinced myself that Roberto's explanation was probably correct, that I had been tired, in an unfamiliar environment, and had misinterpreted natural sounds as something more sinister. That changed completely during my freshman year of college, when I became friends with someone in my anthropology class named Jordan. Jordan was from New Mexico and had grown up in a family that took traditional Native American stories and legends seriously. We often discussed folklore and unexplained phenomena, and Jordan had a vast knowledge of various traditions and beliefs from different tribal cultures throughout the Southwest and West Coast. One evening, as we were studying together in the library, I mentioned my experience in the redwood forest, presenting it as just an interesting story from my teenage years. Jordan listened carefully, asking occasional questions about specific details, the quality of the voice, the behavior of the forest animals, the way the darkness seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. When I finished the story, Jordan was quiet for a long moment, then looked at me with an expression that was part fascination and part concern. Andy, I don't think you encountered another camper or heard acoustic tricks from the forest. What you're describing sounds like a skinwalker. The term meant nothing to me, so Jordan explained. Skinwalkers, according to various Native American traditions, are malevolent entities that have the ability to mimic human voices and appearances. They are known for luring people away from safety by impersonating family members or friends, calling their names in voices that sound almost, but not quite, correct. They're particularly active in areas like the Pacific Northwest, Jordan told me. Old forests with deep spiritual significance. The redwoods would be exactly the kind of place where something like that would be comfortable. Jordan went on to explain that skinwalkers often take the form of animals, particularly canines, and that they typically target people who are isolated from their groups. The fact that you were the last person in your family's group and that you were tired and vulnerable would have made you an ideal target. As Jordan spoke, I felt the same cold fear I had experienced in the forest 4 years earlier. Every detail Jordan mentioned matched my experience perfectly. The voice that sounded almost right but contained subtle wrongness, the unnatural silence of the forest, the glimpse of an animal that moved in ways that seemed impossible. What would have happened if my aunt hadn't found me? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. Jordan's expression grew even more serious. Based on the stories I've heard from my grandfather and other elders, skinwalkers don't just imitate voices for fun. They use the mimicry to lead people away from safety, usually to feed on them or to take their appearance for their own use. If your aunt hadn't interrupted when she did, you might never have made it back to your campsite. That night, I lay awake thinking about what Jordan had told me. The rational part of my mind wanted to reject the explanation as superstition and folklore, but the more I considered it, the more perfectly it fit my experience. The voice that had called my name hadn't just sounded wrong. It had sounded like something non-human trying to imitate human speech patterns without fully understanding them. Over the following weeks, I did my own research into skinwalker legends and similar phenomena from various cultures around the world. What I found was deeply disturbing. Culture after culture had stories about entities that could mimic human voices and appearances, that hunted alone individuals in remote areas, and that were particularly active in ancient forests and other locations with strong spiritual significance. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that my teenage encounter in the redwood forest had been with something far more dangerous than a prankster or a case of mistaken identity. I had been targeted by something that viewed me as prey, and only my aunt's concern and quick action had saved me from a fate I didn't want to contemplate. Today, 5 years after that camping trip, I still love the outdoors and continue to enjoy hiking and camping. But I have developed strict rules for myself that I never break. I never separate from my group in remote areas, especially after dark. I never follow voices that call my name unless I can see who is speaking. And I pay careful attention to my instincts. When something feels wrong, even if I can't explain why, I listen to that feeling. Most importantly, I have never returned to the redwood forests of Northern California. Those ancient giants may be among the most beautiful natural wonders in North America, but I know now that they shelter things that are far older and far more dangerous than most people realize. Whatever called my name in that forest 4 years ago is still out there, still hunting, still waiting for another isolated target who might be curious enough to follow a familiar voice into the darkness. The next time you're camping in a remote area and you hear someone calling your name from the darkness, remember my story. Look carefully to see who is speaking before you respond. And if the voice sounds almost right but somehow wrong, if the forest around you has gone unnaturally quiet, if you feel like unseen eyes are watching you from the shadows, don't investigate. Don't try to help. Just turn around and get back to safety as quickly as you can. Because some things that live in the wild places of this world are very good at sounding like the people we trust most. And they're counting on our natural desire to help others to lead us away from safety and into their domain. Trust me on this one. I know exactly how convincing they can be.